beneath the quiet hills and whispering valleys of Wales, lies a story older than the language itself, a memory written not in ink, but in stone and rain. Imagine this: the wind moves across a rugged plain, brushing the surface of ancient rock where no human voice has yet been heard. The sea crashes against the western cliffs, and from deep within the mountains, rivers carve their patient paths through the slate and soil. This was Wales before Wales, a land without kings or kingdoms, where ice ruled the earth, and the first fires of humanity flickered in the mouths of caves. They were hunters, these first people, wanderers of a colder world. We know them not by name, but by the traces they left behind: a chipped flint blade, a charred bone, the curve of a handprint painted in red ochre on stone. Some say they followed the herds of reindeer and mammoth that once crossed these valleys. Others suggest they came to the west seeking shelter, drawn by the rising sun over the mountains that would one day be called snow. Whatever brought them here, they built the first human memory of this place, a bond between earth and people that has never been broken. As the ages turned, the ice retreated and forests rose from the thawing ground. The Mesolithic hunter gave way to the farmer, and with that, something profound began. A relationship with the land, not of survival, but of belonging. They cleared patches of forest to plant barley, raised rough enclosures for livestock, and buried their dead beneath great stones aligned with the stars. These monuments still stand today, silent, immovable witnesses to lives that once burned bright in the dark. Some believe they were built to honor ancestors, others to mark the cycles of the heavens, but whatever their purpose, they show one thing with clarity, even in prehistory. The people of this land felt time differently. They built for eternity, not for the moment. Walk among the dolmens and burial mounds scattered across the Welsh countryside, and you'll feel it, that subtle hum beneath your feet, the strange gravity of a place that remembers. The air itself seems older, heavier with story. The mist clings to the stones as though unwilling to let them go, and if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear it, the echo of a drum, the rhythm of a forgotten ceremony, the pulse of life returning to the soil. Yet even as the Neolithic gave rise to the Bronze Age, change was constant. Communities grew, traded, fought, and dreamed. They dug copper from the mountains, shaped it with skill and fire, and carried it across the seas to lands whose names we no longer know. The first whispers of culture, of ritual, of myth, they all began here, in the rhythm of the seasons and the turning of the stars. Still, for all their progress, the people lived close to the edge of mystery. The forests were deep, the seas unpredictable, the mountains vast and unknowable. They must have felt small beneath the weight of it all, small but connected. The landscape was alive with meaning, every river a boundary, every hill a guardian, every storm a sign. The Welsh would one day have words for these things: Unwin, the other world; Bryn, the hill that watches; Quam, the valley that holds secrets. But in this early dawn, they simply felt them. The land spoke, and they listened. So tonight, as you lie still and listen to the gentle sound of your breath, imagine this land before the legends, before Arthur, before Rome, a wild ancient canvas where the human story first began, a place where life and death, myth and memory were still one and the same. Because before there was history, before there were kingdoms or names, there was only this, the land that would become Wales, and the quiet certainty that something here would endure, something deep, something unshakable. something that, even now, refuses to be forgotten. And so, our story begins, not with kings or battles, but with silence. The kind of silence that holds the sound of everything yet to come. The centuries moved slowly, like mist creeping through the valleys. And as the people of this land began to shape the world around them, they also began to shape themselves. From the scattered tribes of farmers and herders rose a people attuned to both the earth beneath their feet and the vast heavens above their heads. In the shadow of the standing stones, they began to weave the first threads of what would become Welsh identity, a quiet strength, born not from empire or conquest, but from endurance and reverence. Across the rolling hills, new monuments rose, each one heavy with purpose. Stone circles aligned perfectly with the sun's rise and fall, megaliths casting long shadows that marked the passing of seasons. Archaeologists call them ritual centers, but perhaps there was something more: doorways to understanding, bridges between the living and the dead. Some believe the builders worshipped nature itself. Others think they honored forces beyond human grasp. Whatever the truth, these monuments still breathe mystery. At dawn, when the light filters through the mist and touches those ancient stones, the air feels charged, as if the land itself remembers its creators. By the Bronze Age, bronze weapons and tools shimmered where stone had once ruled. Metal gleamed in the hands of craftsmen whose skill bordered on divine. They carved spirals and suns into their ornaments, symbols that seemed to mirror both sky and soul. Trade networks stretched outward to Ireland, France, even the distant Mediterranean, carrying with them not only goods but stories. Through these stories, identity took root. People began to see themselves as part of something larger: tribe, a people, a homeland. Yet with prosperity came conflict. Hillforts rose like sentinels above the valleys, their wooden palisades and ditches offering defense and dominance. Life was no longer just about survival. It was about territory, belonging, and the right to remain. Some say these fortresses were communities. Others believe they were symbols of power. Either way, they stand as silent witnesses to the growing pulse of human ambition that beat beneath the ancient Welsh sky. As the Bronze Age gave way to iron, new patterns emerged: sharper tools, stronger weapons, and the first true kings of the land. This was a world of clans and chieftains, of shifting alliances and whispered betrayals. Each valley might hold its own lord, each mountain its own god. The people no longer lived merely within nature, they ruled over it, yet never forgot to fear it. The storms still came without warning, the harvests still failed, and in every shadow lingered the memory of ancestors watching from the other world. Their presence shaped belief and ritual. Fires burned atop the hills during solstice nights. Sacrifices were left in sacred lakes, offerings meant to appease unseen forces. It was a religion without temples, a faith without written word, rooted in landscape, in the rising mist, in the whisper of wind through yew and oak. Theirs was a language of reverence, not conquest. Even now, those who walk the Welsh countryside can feel it. The way the air thickens near old burial sites, the way the rivers seem to hum beneath the surface, these sensations are echoes of that ancient understanding that the land itself is alive, and we are only its caretakers. When the first Celtic tribes arrived from the east, they did not erase what came before. They blended with it, bringing new gods, new customs, and a new tongue that would evolve into the Welsh language. Bronze faded to iron, but the old ways endured beneath the surface. Myths began to take shape, the beginnings of the stories that would one day fill the Mabinogion. tales of heroes and enchantments, of love, loss, and transformation. Even before they were written, they lived in the voices of the people, passed from hearth to hearth as the winter winds howled outside. The Celts brought with them artistry and rhythm, culture of poets and warriors. They sang to their ancestors, carved symbols into wood and stone, and celebrated the sacredness of the land. Each mountain had a spirit, each lake a soul. They saw the divine not as distant, but as ever present in the cry of the raven, the shimmer of water, the silence before dawn. To live in this world was to live within myth itself. Yet beneath that beauty, there was always the tension of survival. Raids and rivalries continued, and with each generation, power shifted from one tribe to another. But still, the rhythm of the land held steady. The rains fell, the rivers flowed, the mountains stood unbroken, and through all of it, a single truth endured this land, wild and weathered, shaped its people more than they could ever shape it. In the quiet hours, when the fires burned low and the night pressed close, the elders would speak of the unwon, the other world, a place both near and far, where the dead lived in peace and the gods walked unseen. It was said that the veil between worlds was thinnest in Wales, that one could feel it in the mists that rolled through the valleys, in the sudden chill that came before dawn. Whether or not that was true, the belief itself made the world feel fuller, deeper, more alive. As the Iron Age stretched on, Wales was no longer just a landscape. It had become a presence, living story written across mountains and seas. Every tribe, every settlement, every stone carried the weight of generations who had walked this same soil. Theirs was not a history of empires, but of continuity. And as we leave behind this age of stone and shadow, we move toward something new, an age where the outside world would come knocking, where the quiet strength of this land would be tested by forces vast and foreign. But even then, the heart of Wales would not break. It would only deepen, waiting for the next dawn. The arrival of Rome was not like a storm that comes and goes. It was a slow, grinding tide that reshaped everything in its path. When the legions first set their gaze upon Wales, they saw not a nation, but a tangle of mountains and marshes, home to fierce tribes who refused to kneel. The Romans called it Cambria, and what they found there was unlike any corner of their empire. The Silures in the south and the Ordovices in the north were not people easily conquered. They fought not for gold or glory, but for the land itself, their living, breathing mother. To the Romans, the Welsh hills were a wilderness. To those who lived there, they were sanctuary and soul. It took decades for Rome to subdue even parts of this wild country. They built forts, roads, and watchtowers, carving their order into the chaos of nature. But for every fort they raised, there were valleys untouched by their rule, places where Latin never replaced the old tongue. The Roman legions, trained to fight on open fields, found themselves bleeding on the ridges of Snowdonia, ambushed by warriors who struck like ghosts and vanished into mist. The war against the Silures became legendary. Tacitus himself wrote of their stubbornness, saying no tribe had caused Rome more trouble. Their leader, Caratacus, became a symbol of defiance, a man who led his people against the greatest army on earth, and even when captured, refused to bow his head. His speech before the Roman Senate, preserved in memory and myth, echoed the spirit of his land, that freedom is worth more than life, and no empire, no matter how vast, can conquer the human will. Yet even defiance bends with time. Gradually, Rome's shadow stretched across Wales. Towns rose where none had been. Soldiers settled, trade routes opened, and the old gods found themselves sharing space with new ones. But here, as always, Wales absorbed rather than surrendered. The people learned from Rome its architecture, its roads, its organization, but they never let it define them. The Roman occupation was a layer, not a transformation. Beneath the villas and bathhouses, beneath the Latin inscriptions and foreign customs, the heartbeat of Cymru never stopped. Roman engineers built their fortresses in stone, but the land around them remained untamed, its silence a quiet rebellion. The roads that cut through forests became arteries for trade and travel. Yet they also became pathways for stories, carrying whispers of the old ways from tribe to tribe. Even Roman gods began to change their names here, merging with the Celtic deities of river and sky. Jupiter became a sky-father familiar to both worlds. Mars became a spirit of battle known in the ancient tongue. It was cultural alchemy, the blending of two worlds into something unique. The Welsh did not merely survive Roman rule, they reshaped it. For 3 centuries, Rome held its grip, but its hold was never absolute. The forts at Caerleon, Carnarvon, and Sigentium stood as monuments to empire. Yet beyond their walls stretched an untamed wilderness that answered to no emperor. The mountains kept their secrets, the druids kept their faith, and the rivers carried the old songs long after Latin faded from the ears of soldiers. In time, the legions withdrew, called back to defend a crumbling empire. The great machine of Rome began to collapse, and what remained in Wales was not ruin, but renewal. As the eagle banners disappeared beyond the sea, the people who had endured beneath the weight of empire began to rise again, free to reclaim what had always been theirs. But they were no longer the same as before. The centuries of occupation had left their mark not as chains, but as scars that strengthened rather than weakened. Roman stonework remained, Roman roads endured, and with them came new knowledge of building, farming, and trade. Out of occupation had grown resilience. Out of subjugation had come transformation. In this new dawn, the tribes that had once fought each other began to unite under shared lineage and language. They called themselves Cymru fellow countrymen. It was more than a word. It was a declaration that identity could survive even the weight of empire. The Romans had brought order, but the Welsh brought meaning. The ruins they left behind became silent teachers, reminders that even the mightiest fall, and only the rooted endure. The departure of Rome left a void across Britain, vacuum filled by chaos, migration, and war. But in Wales, something different took shape. The land remembered how to endure. The forests crept back over abandoned forts, rivers reclaimed bridges, and the mountains stood unchanged, watching as a new chapter began. Christianity began to take root, not as the imperial faith of Rome, but as a native one spread by wandering monks and saints who carried not swords but scriptures, who built stone cells along windswept cliffs and whispered prayers in the old tongue. Faith here was not foreign. It grew like ivy over the ruins of empire, binding past and future together. Out of the Roman shadow emerged a new kind of strength that was spiritual, poetic, and deeply personal. The Welsh did not inherit the empire's grandeur, but they inherited its memory, and they turned it into story. The ruins of Caerleon became places of myth, where later generations would imagine Arthur's court and the Knights of the Round Table. The stones Rome left behind were not monuments to conquest, but seeds for legend. History began to blur into mythology, and mythology began to define identity. In the end, Rome conquered lands, but not the soul of Wales. When the empire fell, Its legacy crumbled like dust, but the Welsh endured and changed in essence, unbroken in spirit. They had learned what every small nation must, that power does not lie in armies or walls, but in memory and meaning. And so the Roman shadow faded, but in its place rose the first light of the Welsh kingdom's new dawn over an ancient land. When the eagle of Rome finally retreated beyond the sea, Britain fractured like glass under pressure. The roads once patrolled by legionaries grew silent, overgrown with moss and wildflowers. Yet in Wales, that silence was not decayed, was the sound of rebirth. Out of the ruins of empire, the people began to shape themselves anew. What had been tribes scattered, independent, proud slowly became something more organized, something enduring. The land itself dictated its divisions. Mountains carved borders, rivers marked frontiers, and ancient hill forts became the centers of new power. In the north, the kingdom of Gwynedd took shape beneath the shadow of Eryri, what the English would later call Snowdonia. To the south, Dyfed grew around the old Roman lands, its rulers tracing their bloodlines to warriors and saints. Powys rose in the fertile heartlands, guarding the passes that led eastward toward the Saxon frontier. And along the western coast, the sea-born kingdom of Ceredigion looked out toward Ireland, its people shaped by both trade and isolation. These early Welsh kingdoms were not empires of wealth, but of resilience. Their kings ruled from timber halls, not marble palaces, and their power came from loyalty, lineage, and land. In the place of Roman legions came local war bands, warriors who swore oaths to their lords and defended their valleys with a fierce, personal devotion. Each kingdom was a living memory of the tribes before it, each name a song carried forward through centuries of survival. Yet even as they grew, they were bound together by something deeper than politics, a shared language, a shared myth, a shared understanding that they were all Cymry, the people of this land. Still, unity was fragile. Rivalries ran deep, and ambition often turned brother against brother. Kings like Melgan of Gwynedd rose and fell, their stories preserved in both praise and warning. The bards, those guardians of memory, began to emerge as the true chroniclers of Wales. Their songs told not only of victories and feasts, but of moral lessons, of destiny, of the delicate balance between pride and ruin. In their verses, a king's worth was not measured by gold or conquest, but by his honor, his generosity, and his harmony with the land. This was no mere political rebirth, it was cultural. The age of kingdoms was the age when the Welsh soul began to speak aloud. From this soil, legends took root. The stories of Arthur, Myrddin, and the enchanted otherworld of Unwin were born not in the courts of kings, but in the collective dream of a people who had learned to survive through story. Some say Arthur was a memory of a warlord who fought to defend Britain from the Saxons. Others believe he was a symbol of the lost unity between the Celtic tribes. Either way, his legend became a mirror, reflecting what the Welsh longed for, a leader who could hold the land together, protect it from the darkness encroaching from the east, and restore the balance once held under the old gods. But balance is never easy to keep. To the east, new powers were rising. The Angles and Saxons poured into Britain, carving out their own realms and pushing the Britons westward. The borderlands became a place of perpetual tension, a meeting point between two worlds, between Christianity and paganism, between survival and extinction. Yet Wales did not fall. The mountains and valleys that once sheltered the tribes now served as fortresses. Invaders could burn villages, but they could not conquer the landscape itself. Every path, every river crossing, every mist-covered hill was known to the locals but alien to those who marched in from afar. Geography became weapon and ally alike. This defiance was not born of arrogance, but of necessity. The people of Wales had seen empires come and go. They had no illusions about permanence. Instead, they built their strengths in what could not be destroyed: memory, language, song. The courts of the Welsh princes were alive with this culture. Poets, scholars, and musicians thrived under royal patronage. In the flicker of torchlight, amid the scent of wood smoke and mead, they sang of heroes long dead and prophecies yet to come. The past was not distant, it was alive, breathing through every word, and from these songs the identity of a nation began to solidify. It was no longer just about survival, it was about meaning. Christianity, too, deepened its roots during this time. Monasteries rose in secluded valleys, places like St. David's, Bangor, and Llantwit, major becoming sanctuaries of both faith and learning. The saints of Wales, David, Tilo, and countless others travelled the land on foot, carrying nothing but devotion and courage. Their influence was profound. They did not erase the old beliefs, but absorbed them, merging ancient reverence for nature with the message of redemption and peace. The divine was no longer distant. It was present in every spring, every stone, every mountain breeze. To be Welsh was to live in a world where the physical and spiritual were one. But beneath this golden age of kings and saints, the undercurrent of struggle never ceased. Alliances shifted like rivers after rain, and the dream of unity often dissolved into rivalry. Still, through every feud and battle, the sense of being part of something ancient endured. The kings may have changed, the borders may have shifted, but the land remained the constant heart of a people whose roots reached deep. And as centuries turned, and as the outside world grew louder, that heart continued to beat in the dark valleys and wind-worn hills. The Welsh kingdoms were not empires of conquest, but fortresses of memory, each one a testament to endurance. For in a world where everything else crumbled, they learned the oldest lesson of all, that what endures is not the sword, nor the crown, but the story. And in Wales, the story had only just begun. In the centuries that followed the fall of Rome and the birth of the Welsh kingdoms, a quiet transformation swept across the land, a transformation not driven by armies or kings, but by wandering saints and the whispers of faith carried on the wind. It was an age when the sacred and the strange walked side by side, when miracles mingled with memory, and when the boundary between the natural and the divine blurred into mist. Across Wales, from the rocky cliffs of Pembrokeshire to the deep forests of Gwynedd, small communities began to form around figures whose lives balanced between legend and devotion. They were men and women who left behind worldly ambitions to live in prayer and poverty, who carved cells into the sides of mountains, and who built churches on sites once sacred to older gods. These saints David, Iltad, Godoc, Tilo, Bueno, Melangel became the beating heart of a spiritual movement that reshaped the Welsh soul. Yet theirs was no grand cathedral faith. Their Christianity was wild, intimate, and deeply rooted in the land. The monasteries they built were not fortresses of stone, but clusters of timber huts encircled by earth walls, more like sanctuaries than institutions. Inside these sacred enclosures, life moved to a rhythm older than time, the rhythm of prayer, labor, and silence. At dawn, bells rang softly over misty valleys. By dusk, hymns rose into the dark, mingling with the cry of owls and the rushing of streams. To live in these places was to live between worlds, the human and the divine, the temporal and the eternal. The saints spoke to both. Saint David, the most revered of all, preached simplicity and humility. His followers told of miracles, the ground rising beneath his feet as he spoke to a gathered crowd, water springing from dry earth, and birds descending upon his shoulders in peace. Yet beyond the miracles, it was his message that endured: be joyful, keep the faith, and do the little things. In that simple wisdom lay the essence of Welsh spirituality, the belief that greatness is not found in power, but in endurance, in the quiet act of living rightly amid hardship. Around these saints grew communities bound by devotion and story. Pilgrims travelled along rough paths to seek blessings, carrying offerings of wool, honey, and bread. Wells dedicated to the saints became places of healing. Springs and stones once revered in pagan times now bore the names of Christian miracles. But even as Christianity spread, the old ways did not vanish. They transformed. The sacred groves became churchyards. The spirits of water and earth found new names, and the ancient reverence for nature was woven into the Christian worldview. The Welsh faith was never one of conquest, was one of continuity. The saints did not destroy the past. They sanctified it. Still, faith alone could not shield the land from the turbulence that grew beyond its borders. To the east, the Saxons tightened their grip on Britain. To the west, Irish raiders swept across the sea. Yet in these invasions, the monasteries of Wales became more than places of worship. They became refuges of knowledge. Monks copied ancient texts by candlelight, preserving fragments of history and myth that might otherwise have vanished. It was in these quiet scriptoriums that the first written Welsh language began to take form, that the oral stories of warriors and kings were set down on parchment, that memory itself found permanence in ink. Through faith, culture found a vessel, but the world outside grew darker. Viking sails appeared on the horizon, their dragon-proud ships slicing through the fog. Monasteries that once rang with hymns now echoed with the sound of fire and steel. The raiders struck without warning, taking what they could and burning the rest. Holy men were martyred, relics were scattered, and the peaceful rhythm of monastic life was broken by violence. Yet even in ruin, Wales endured. Out of destruction came defiance. The saints' stories grew stronger, more miraculous, more intertwined with the idea of protection and resilience. Saint Bruno, it was said, could raise the dead. Saint Melangle was guarded by hares that no hunter dared harm. Saint David's shrine became a beacon of hope in a time of chaos. Faith and legend intertwined so deeply that they became inseparable. And from their union emerged a distinct identity, one that could survive the loss of cities, armies, and even centuries. It was during this time that the idea of Wales as a sacred land began to take root. Not sacred because it was pure or peaceful, but because it was enduring. Every stone, every river, every mountain carried the trace of something holy. The divine was not distant. It was immanent, living in the soil itself. The monks who walked barefoot along coastal paths, the farmers who prayed before ploughing their fields, the poets who sang of saints and heroes, they all understood this truth, that holiness was not confined to churches, but woven through all things. And so, in the age of saints and shadows, Wales became a sanctuary not only for faith, but for memory. The monasteries, though scarred by war, became seeds of culture, the foundations upon which the later Welsh identity would be built. From their illuminated manuscripts and oral tales would grow a literature that rivaled any in Europe, and from their faith would rise a sense of nationhood that no conqueror could extinguish. Yet, as this sacred age faded, another storm gathered on the horizon. The Vikings had tested the coasts, but greater powers were coming, Normans with castles, kings with armies, empires with ambition. The peace of saints would soon give way to the politics of princes, and the simple prayer would be drowned out by the clash of steel. But for now, in this moment of twilight between eras, the land was alive with faith, its hills breathing the stories of those who sought not power but peace. The saints had left their mark not in monuments or conquests, but in the quiet conviction that this land, above all others, was chosen to remember, and in that memory Wales found its soul. As the mists of the early Middle Ages lifted, Wales entered an age both glorious and brutal, an era of poetry and war, of noble dreams and blood-soaked fields. The age of princes was the heartbeat of medieval Wales, a time when fragmented kingdoms sought unity, when courage was measured in loyalty, and when the fate of a people hung upon the strength of their leaders. Out of the ruins of monasteries and the sanctuaries of saints, new powers emerged, princes who ruled not with divine right, but with earned respect. They were the heirs of tribal chiefs and the descendants of warrior kings, men who held their thrones by the sword and their people by the word. It was a time when every valley had its lord, every mountain pass its watchtower, and every song carried both prophecy and warning. In Gwynedd, under the shadow of Snowdonia's peaks, a lineage rose that would define the destiny of a nation. The house of Aberfraw, founded by Rhodri Morthe, great stood as the beating heart of Welsh independence. Rhodri's rule, stretching across Gwynedd, Powys, and Dyfed, marked one of the first moments when Wales felt the possibility of unity. His reign was not merely political. It was symbolic, a dream that this land, so long divided by geography and pride, could breathe as one body. But unity came at a cost. To the east, the Saxons of Mercia and Wessex eyed the Welsh frontiers with ambition. Raids and counter-raids became the rhythm of life. Yet Rhodri fought not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. When he fell in battle against the English, his death became legend, his spirit immortalized in bardic song. His sons carried on his legacy, dividing and reuniting the realm in a cycle that reflected the very nature of Wales, itself resilient, fragmented and eternal. In these centuries, the bards flourished as never before. Their voices echoed through timber halls, weaving tales of valor and betrayal, of kings who rose from nothing, and of prophecies whispered by the wind. The poetry of this age was not entertainment. It was identity. The bards were historians, philosophers, and magicians of memory. Through their verses, the deeds of the princes were transformed into myth, and the line between truth and legend blurred into beauty. They sang of Hywel Didie Hywel, the good whose wisdom gave Wales its first unified code of law. His laws were remarkable for their time-measured, humane, even merciful. They balanced justice with compassion, acknowledging not only crime but circumstance. Where other nations punished, Wales restored. Where others ruled through fear, Hywel sought order through fairness. It was a vision of governance that reflected the heart of his people, pragmatic, communal, and deeply aware of balance. His assembly at Tywyn ar Daff became the seed of something greater, a vision of Wales not as scattered kingdoms, but as one land governed by one mind. Yet no peace could last forever. After Hywel's death, the fragile unity dissolved once more into rivalry. The age that followed was one of shifting loyalties, of lords rising and falling like tides. The Normans arrived in Britain, and with them came a new kind of warfare, organized, relentless, fortified in stone. They built castles along the borderlands, the marches pushing slowly into Welsh territory, one valley at a time. Against this encroachment, the princes fought with both ferocity and cunning. Men like Griffith ap Cynan and his son Owain Glyndŵr became the defenders of Welsh freedom, masters of guerrilla warfare who used the landscape itself as their ally. The forests and mountains became their fortresses, the weather their silent weapon. Owain Glyndŵr's rule was a golden moment, a brief resurgence of unity, a time when the power of the Welsh princes stood firm against foreign kings. He was admired not only for his strength, but for his intellect. He cultivated poets and scholars, blending the art of rule with the art of wisdom. Under his leadership, Gwynedd thrived, and for a fleeting heartbeat of history, it seemed that Wales might once again become whole. But history moves like the tide, and with each rise comes another fall. After Owain's death, the unity he built fractured under the weight of succession disputes. Brothers turned against brothers, sons against fathers, and the dream of a united Wales faded once more into mist. Yet even in division, something remarkable persisted: the unbroken will to remain free. The castles of the marcher lords might have dominated the plains, but in the mountains, in the hearts of poets and peasants alike, the old fire burned. It was during this age that the Arthurian legends flourished, reshaped by Welsh imagination. The bards spoke of a once and future king who would return in the nation's hour of need. Some believed Arthur still slept beneath the hills, his knights waiting beside him, his sword glimmering in the dark. It was more than a story. It was a promise that Wales, though often conquered, could never be defeated in spirit. The age of princes was both triumph and tragedy, a mosaic of glory and grief, bound by song. It was an age when the idea of Wales matured, when the struggle for independence became not just political, but spiritual. The princes who ruled may have been mortal, their reigns brief and bloody, but the legacy they left was eternal. They proved that identity could survive even in chaos, that a small nation could outlast empires through the strength of memory and the endurance of culture. And as the 12th century waned, and the shadow of England grew darker on the horizon, one final prince would rise to carry that legacy to its breaking point. His name would echo through the centuries: Llewellyn ap Griffith, the last prince of an independent Wales. But before his fall, the age of princes would reach its crescendo, and the dream of a free Cymru would burn brighter than ever before, lighting the night even as the storm gathered beyond the mountains. By the dawn of the 13th century, Wales stood at a crossroads between legend and extinction. The air was heavy with prophecy and the scent of smoke from distant wars. The Norman castles along the border gleamed like iron teeth biting into the earth, while deep in the heart of Gwynedd, one man rose to gather the scattered pieces of a broken land. His name was Llewellyn ap Griffith, grandson of the great Llewellyn the Great. And to his people, he was not just a ruler, he was hope made flesh. Born into a time of turmoil, Llewellyn grew amid blood feuds and betrayals. The Welsh princes had long fought each other as fiercely as they fought their invaders. But Llewellyn saw what others could not, that disunity was a death sentence. The Normans had come and gone. The English were here to stay. If Wales was to survive, it could no longer be a collection of kingdoms. It had to be one nation, one will, one heartbeat. And so he began the impossible task of uniting his people, not through conquest alone, but through vision. His early years were marked by struggle. Rivals within his own family sought his downfall, and English kings watched with suspicion as his influence grew. Yet Llywelyn was patient, deliberate, and as fierce in diplomacy as he was in war. He forged alliances, reclaimed lost lands, and through sheer force of will, restored the authority of Gwynedd. Slowly, valley by valley, castle by castle, Wales began to remember itself. The people called him Llywelyn. I'm Lee Olaf Llywelyn, our last leader under his banner. They dared to dream once more. He ruled not as a tyrant, but as a guardian, defending both land and law. He understood the fragile bond between ruler and ruled, between freedom and survival. His court became a place of learning and culture, where bards sang of heroes and monks chronicled the deeds of the living. The laws of Hywel were revived, and Welsh justice shone again with reason and fairness in an age of cruelty. For a brief, miraculous moment, it seemed the dream of a united Wales might truly be realized. But across the border, another figure watched the rising star of Gwynedd with cold calculation: King Edward I of England. Edward was no mere monarch. He was an architect of empire, a man who saw conquest as destiny. To him, Wales was not a nation, but an obstacle, a wilderness to be tamed and absorbed. He had learned from his predecessors' failures. Where others had waged war in bursts of fury, Edward prepared for total dominations, slow, methodical, and absolute. At first, Llywelyn sought peace. He had no desire to waste his people's strength in endless war, but Edward would not be appeased. When Llywelyn refused to attend the English king's court to swear fealty, a demand he saw as humiliation, the storm began. In 1277, Edward invaded Wales with overwhelming force. English armies poured through the valleys, their banners darkening the sky. Llywelyn was forced into retreat, his lands seized, his power broken. But even in defeat, he remained unyielding. The land itself became his ally once again. The mountains swallowed his men. The forests concealed his scouts. When Edward's army withdrew, Llywelyn rose once more, rebuilding his strength in the shadows. For a time, there was uneasy peace, yet beneath it lay the certainty of another war, final reckoning between empire and identity. That reckoning came in 1282. Llywelyn's brother Dyfed, once loyal to the English crown, rebelled against Edward's rule, forcing Llywelyn to choose between surrender and defiance. He chose defiance. Across Wales, the call to arms echoed like thunder. Castles fell, English garrisons were driven out, and for a fleeting season, the Red Dragon of Cymru rose proudly once again. But Edward's response was relentless. His armies marched west with siege engines, engineers, and mercenaries. The campaign was merciless and total. Villages burned, harvests were destroyed, and those who resisted were slaughtered. Llywelyn fought not for power now, but for survival, for the right of his people to remain who they were. In December 1282, near the town of Builth, the end came quietly. Betrayed by misinformation, separated from his forces, Llywelyn rode into an ambush. He was struck down by a single English soldier, his identity not even known until after his death. His head was taken to Edward, who ordered it crowned mockingly with ivy and displayed on the Tower of London. With that act, the last native prince of Wales was gone, and the dream of independence was buried beneath the weight of empire. But even in death, Llywelyn's story did not end. The land mourned him, and the poets transformed his fall into prophecy. They sang that he would one day return, that no conqueror could truly possess the mountains, that the red dragon would rise again when the time was right. His body may have been lost to history, but his spirit lived on in the valleys, in the language, in the songs whispered by shepherds on cold nights. Edward built castles to cement his victory. Carnarvon Conwy, Harlockstone giants, meant to remind the Welsh of their defeat. Yet with every tower he raised, he also built a monument to the nation he could never fully conquer. For even the might of an empire could not erase what Llywelyn had revived, the idea of Wales as one people. In the centuries to come, the princes would fade into legend, their bloodlines broken, their lands absorbed into English rule. But their legacy endured as something far greater than sovereignty. They had proven that the essence of a nation is not found in crowns or borders, but in the unyielding will to remain. The last prince had fallen, but in falling, he had given his people something eternal, a memory that could never be conquered. And as night closed over the mountains and the fires of rebellion flickered out one by one, the land itself seemed to whisper his name, carrying it into eternity. The prince who fell, yet never truly died. After Llywelyn's death, a deep stillness settled over Wales. It was the silence that follows a storm, the kind that feels heavier than sound itself. The valleys that had once echoed with the clash of arms now lay quiet beneath the shadow of new fortresses. Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, turned his full attention to securing his conquest of Wales, and he did so not with fleeting battles, but with the permanence of stone. One by one, the great castles rose: Carnarvon, Beaumaris, Harlech, Conwy, placed like a nail in the coffin of Welsh independence. They were not just fortresses, they were symbols. Carnarvon, with its polygonal towers and imperial design, was meant to resemble Constantinople itself, a statement that Edward was no mere conqueror, but a ruler of empires. And in 1284, to mark his triumph, he issued the Statute of Rhuddlan, formally annexing Wales into the English crown. It was the first time in history that Wales was placed fully under foreign rule. The princes were gone, their lands confiscated, their families scattered. English administrators governed the shires. English law replaced the ancient codes of Hywel Dda, and English soldiers patrolled the once free mountains. Edward believed he had ended Wales, but a land so old cannot be erased, it only changes shape. The Welsh people adapted. The farmers still ploughed their fields. The shepherds still led their flocks through misted hills. The bards still sang, though now in secret or in sorrow. In taverns and chapels, stories of the old princes were whispered as prayers rather than history. They spoke of Llywelyn's spirit wandering the mountains, watching over his people, waiting for the time when the red dragon would rise again. The conqueror had claimed the land, but the heart of Wales had slipped through his grasp like smoke. In 1301, Edward made one final gesture meant to bind Wales to his throne forever. He declared his newborn son Prince of Wales, presenting him to the Welsh lords as their new liege. Legend says he promised them a prince born in Wales and who spoke no English, a cruel twist of irony, as the child was too young to speak at all. The title stuck, and from that moment onward, every heir to the English crown would bear it. To the world, this was the mark of submission. To the Welsh, it was a scar. Yet beneath the surface of submission, resistance endured. The 14th century saw flickers of rebellion, small uprisings, local defiance, whispered vows of freedom. But none could rekindle the fire that had once burned under Llywelyn. Until, at last, a new voice rose from the mists of history, a man who would be called the last rebel of the old world. His name was Owain Glyndŵr. Like Llywelyn, he was of noble blood, descended from the ancient princes. But unlike them, he lived under a foreign crown, a lord in a land that no longer belonged to him. For years, he served the English faithfully, even studying law in London. Yet the seeds of rebellion were already planted deep in his heart. When his lands were seized by a greedy English neighbour, and the king ignored his plea for justice, something inside him broke. What began as a personal feud ignited into a national revolt. In 1400, Owain Glyndŵr was proclaimed Prince of Wales, and the valleys erupted once more. This was no simple rebellion. It was a resurrection. The dragon banner flew again, and for the first time in over a century, Wales rallied behind a single leader. Castles fell, towns burned, and English authority crumbled across the countryside. The old songs returned, now carried not by bards but by soldiers. Owain dreamed not just of resistance, but of restoration. He envisioned a free Welsh parliament, universities, and a church independent from Rome and England alike. For a time, it seemed destiny favoured him. France offered him support, and his forces captured most of northern and central Wales. The English crown trembled as an old nation stirred in its sleep. But as with all Welsh dreams, the tide of history turned cruel. Betrayal, famine, and relentless warfare wore down Glyndwr's armies. His allies fell away, his castles were taken, and his people suffered. Yet he refused to surrender, even when his family was captured, even when the English scoured the land for him. He vanished into the hills, unseen and unbroken. His fate remains one of the great mysteries of history. No one knows how or where he died. Some say he lived out his final days as a hermit, wandering the forests of mid-Wales. Others whisper he escaped to France, or that he waits still, like Arthur and Llywelyn before him, to return when Wales needs him most. His rebellion failed in the eyes of kings, but in the soul of a nation it succeeded beyond measure, for it reminded the Welsh who they weren't, what they could be again. After Glyndŵr, the iron grip of England tightened once more. The Tudor dynasty, though Welsh in blood, ruled from London and sought to erase the last traces of distinction between the two realms. The laws in Wales, Acts of 1535 and 1542, completed the conquest that Edward had begun 2 centuries earlier. Welsh was banned in government, English law became absolute, and the native nobility was absorbed into the English gentry. Yet even this assimilation could not destroy what conquest never could: the language, the stories, the faith of the people. Through centuries of silence, the Welsh tongue endured. It was spoken in homes, in chapels, on mountain paths. The songs that had once praised princes now became hymns and laments, preserving history in melody. The land, though conquered, still breathed with ancient memory. In the quiet of the hills, one could still feel the pulse of something older than empire, something eternal. The castles Edward built, those cold monuments to power, began to crumble, their stones reclaimed by moss and wind. And in their decay, a strange justice was revealed. The empire that sought to erase Wales had instead immortalized it. Every tower that fell became a reminder that all crowns rust, all kings fade, but the land remains. And so Wales entered a new age, one without princes or banners, yet still guided by the same quiet defiance that had always defined it. The dragon slept, but it did not die. It waited beneath the soil, patient as the mountains, dreaming of the day it would rise again. The centuries that followed Owain Glyndŵr's disappearance were years of silence on the surface, but storm beneath. The Welsh had learned that open defiance brought only ruin, And so they turned their energy inward to endurance, to preservation, to memory. The wars had taken their lords, the crown had taken their freedom, but no king could take their language or their soul. In the shadow of English law, a quieter kind of rebellion began, not with swords or banners, but with words, with prayer, with song. The 16th century brought sweeping changes across Britain. The Reformation tore apart the old church, and in its wake, a strange opportunity appeared for Wales. When Henry VIII, himself of Welsh descent through the Tudors, broke from Rome, the Bible was translated into English for the first time. But in Wales, a man named William Morgan saw a greater need. He believed that if the Welsh were to keep their faith, they must also keep their tongue. And so, in 1588, he completed the first full translation of the Bible into Welsh. It was more than a religious act. It was a declaration of survival. The language of the poets became the language of God, and for generations afterward, it would be spoken in every chapel and every home. While England marched toward empire, Wales became a nation of the spirit, its resistance hidden in plain sight. The chapels that rose across the countryside in later centuries were not just places of worships, they were sanctuaries of identity. Inside their walls, hymns carried the rhythm of old battle songs, and sermons echoed the pride of lost kingdoms. The people who gathered there may have seemed humble, but they carried within them an unbroken lineage stretching back to the age of the Druids. The 17th and 18th centuries were times of hardship, yet also of quiet brilliance. While the English saw Wales as a remote province, the Welsh preserved something that the rest of Europe had forgotten: the continuity of an ancient tongue, a living link to the Celtic world. In the small towns and mountain villages, poets and preachers became the new princes. They led not armies, but minds. Their weapon was the word, and their battleground was memory itself. The Eisteddfod, that ancient festival of song and poetry, was revived, keeping alive the art of the bards who had once sung for kings. Though the crowns were gone, the spirit of their music endured, passed from father to son, mother to daughter, like a hidden flame. But even the quietest flame must eventually face the storm. By the time the Industrial Revolution arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries, Wales was about to be reshaped once again, this time not by invasion, but by transformation. Coal, iron, and slate turned the valleys into engines of empire. Where once had been forest and farm, now rose furnaces, mines, and railways. Towns like Merthyr, Tydfil, and Ranthor became names of power and suffering alike. The wealth of Britain flowed through Welsh soil, but little of it stayed there. Men worked 12 hours a day in the darkness of the mines, their lungs filled with dust, their backs bent beneath the weight of progress. The black gold that fueled the empire came at the price of human breath. Yet even in this age of iron and smoke, the Welsh spirit adapted once more. The industrial towns gave rise to a new kind of community, one bound not by bloodlines or castles, but by solidarity and song. The miners sang hymns as they descended into the earth, their voices echoing through the tunnels like the psalms of an underground church. In the evenings, they gathered in chapels or around fires, turning hardship into harmony. Music became their refuge, their rebellion. From these dark valleys came voices that would one day echo across the world, voices forged in struggle, tempered by hope. The 19th century also brought a rising tide of education and self-awareness. The people began to see themselves not as a conquered province, but as a culture with its own destiny. Newspapers were printed in Welsh, schools taught in both tongues, and politicians began to speak once more of autonomy. Yet with progress came new wounds. The 1847 Blue Books report, commissioned by the English government, condemned Welsh culture as backward and immoral, blaming the Welsh language for poverty and ignorance. It was an insult dressed as reform, and it struck deep. Many Welsh children were punished in schools for speaking their own language. Forced to wear the Welsh natur wooden token of shame hung around their necks until another child spoke Welsh. For decades, an entire generation was made to feel that their mother tongue was a burden, not a blessing, and yet the people endured. The more they were told to forget, the more they remembered. The chapels continued to preach in Welsh. The poets continued to write. The miners continued to sing. When one voice was silenced, another rose to take its place. Out of this quiet defiance came a deeper strength, one that would shape the Wales of the future. The land was still under English rule, but its people had learned that true freedom begins not with borders, but with belonging. They had no armies, no crowns, no great cities, but they had each other, and they had the word. By the end of the 19th century, Wales had transformed once again from a conquered kingdom into a nation of conscience. It was a place where the poorest man could quote poetry, where the coal miner could outsing a lord. In the rhythm of hymns and the lilt of language, the people had built something that no invader could destroy: identity. And though the valleys were dark with soot and the castles of the princes lay in ruin, there was light in the voices that rose from every village. They sang not of conquest or loss, but of endurance, of the long road of their history, and of the hope that one day the red dragon would breathe again. For in every age, Wales had been many things: the land of kings, of rebels, of workers, of dreamers, but above all, it had always been a land that remembered. And in that remembrance lay the quiet, unbroken pulse of freedom. As the 19th century waned and the 20th approached, Wales found itself standing at the edge of two worlds, one bound by the soot of the industrial age, and another illuminated by the fragile promise of modern identity. The coal seams still ran deep, the furnaces still roared, but the people who labored beneath their smoke began to stir with a different kind of energy. It was not rebellion this time, not in the sense of swords or marches, but a rising awareness that their culture, language, and unity could no longer remain buried beneath empire. Outwardly, Wales was still a province of the British state, its wealth extracted, its power centralized elsewhere. But inwardly, something ancient had begun to wake. The chapels that dotted every hillside, built by the sweat of miners and farmers, had become not only houses of worship but engines of social change. From their pulpits came not just sermons, but ideas about fairness, justice, and dignity. The nonconformist movement, deeply rooted in Welsh faith, began to challenge both the Anglican Church and the social order itself. The preachers spoke of equality before God, and in their voices the old Welsh yearning for freedom was reborn, this time in moral and political form. By the late 1800s, the push for education, rights, and representation had gathered unstoppable momentum. The people who once had no say in their governance began sending their own to Parliament. Men like David Lloyd George, a boy raised in the small village of Llanystumdwy, rose from humble beginnings to become voices for the voiceless. Lloyd George embodied the contradictions of the age, both deeply Welsh and wholly political, both champion of reform and servant of empire. Yet his rise symbolized something larger, that Wales was no longer content to be a quiet corner of another nation's story. It demanded a voice of its own, and that voice, though often ignored, began to echo through the corridors of power. But as progress came, so too did loss. The industrial wealth that had once seemed endless began to fade with the changing world. By the early 20th century, the coal mines that had fueled the British Empire began to wane. The great engines of steel and slate slowed, their smoke replaced by silence. Communities built around labor found themselves facing unemployment, poverty, and decline. The land that had given so much was now exhausted, and the empire that had consumed it moved on. Yet even as the economy faltered, the spirit of Wales refused to be extinguished. The early 1900s saw a cultural revival unlike anything since the age of the princes. Scholars, poets, and activists sought to reclaim what centuries of conquest and assimilation had tried to erase. The Eisteddfod blossomed into a national institution, a living link between past and present. Writers like Saunders, Lewis, and R.S. Thomas rekindled the ancient fire of Welsh expression, transforming language into resistance. The Welsh language, long suppressed, began its slow ascent from the margins back into the heart of identity. In schools, chapels, and local councils, voices rose in defense of it not as nostalgia, but as necessity. For the Welsh had learned the hardest truth of all, that a people without their language are a people without memory. And so, in defiance of modern convenience and imperial uniformity, they chose to remember. The First World War brought tragedy to Wales, as it did everywhere. The valleys that had sung of hope now echoed with the names of the dead. The sons of miners and farmers marched to foreign fields under foreign banners, believing that sacrifice might bring recognition. When peace came, it was fragile and fleeting. The 1920s and 30s saw depression grip the coal towns, hunger return to the kitchens, and despair haunt the working class. Yet even then, the Welsh refused to surrender to silence. They sang, they organized, they demanded change. The hunger marches that began in the south were not just protests of poverty, they were declarations of worth. Every banner carried through the rain, every voice raised in defiance. It was a continuation of the same struggle that had begun with Llewellyn and Glyndŵr, the fight to be seen, to be heard, to exist on their own terms. The Second World War brought yet another transformation. Welsh soldiers fought once again under the British flag, but on the home front, something more subtle took root. The evacuation of children from English cities brought new faces to the valleys and mountains, exposing outsiders to the language, the songs, the strangeness of Welsh identity. Some came to love it, others mocked it, but all were touched by it in ways that could not easily be forgotten. When the war ended, the world had changed forever. Empires began to crumble, nations redefined themselves, and Wales, though still under the shadow of its larger neighbour, began to imagine a future that was once again its own. The mid-20th century marked the birth of the modern Welsh nation, not in law, but in spirit. New movements emerged to protect the language, the environment, and the sense of belonging that tied the people to their land. When the Tryweryn Valley was drowned in 1965 to create a reservoir for Liverpool, the outcry was not just about water or loss of homes, it was about dignity. The words Cofich Tryweryn, remember Tryweryn, became a rallying cry, painted on walls across the country. It was a reminder that memory itself had become the weapon of survival. Wales was no longer just a conquered land, it was a conscience. Through political awakening, cultural revival, and artistic expression, it began to reclaim the narrative of its own history. The old castles of conquest became tourist ruins, while the chapels of rebellion echoed with new songs. The dragons stirred again, not with fire this time, but with awareness. And in the hum of the last collieries, in the roar of new industries, and in the quiet persistence of its people, Wales rediscovered what it had always known, that it does not need permission to exist. Beneath the ash of empire, the fire still burned, steady, patient, and waiting. And though centuries had passed since Llywelyn fell and Owain vanished into legend, their dream had not died. It had simply changed form, breathing now through the voices of a modern people who understood that sometimes the most powerful rebellions begin in silence. By the late 20th century, the struggle for Welsh identity had moved from the battlefield and the chapel into the heart of daily life. The language that had once been the breath of kings and bards was now fighting for its survival on the lips of ordinary people. For centuries, it had been pushed to the margins, dismissed as backward, discouraged in schools, and ridiculed in polite society. Yet somehow, despite the weight of empire, the spread of English, and the silence of modernity, Welsh endured. It survived not through governments or armies, but through mothers whispering lullabies, preachers reciting psalms, and poets who refused to let their nation's voice fade. In the cold towns and coastal villages, in the farms tucked between green hills, people continued to speak the old tongue because it felt like breathing something too natural to surrender. But by the 1960s, the danger was real. Census reports showed a steady decline in Welsh speakers, and fears grew that within a generation, the language could vanish. It was in this moment of uncertainty that a new movement arose, not from scholars or politicians, but from students, workers, and dreamers who understood that the fight for Welsh was not just about words, but about existence. In 1962, the Welsh Language Society Simdeitha's Year Aeth Gymraeg was born. Inspired by a fiery speech from Saunders Lewis, the society's founders rejected silence. They believed that if Wales was to have a future, it had to defend its voice with the same passion its ancestors once defended their land. What followed was a new kind of rebellion, peaceful, creative, and relentless. Activists painted road signs, disrupted BBC broadcasts, and refused to pay fines for demanding Welsh language rights. They occupied offices, chained themselves to railings, and spoke only Welsh in court, forcing judges to confront the reality of a nation within a nation. To some, they were troublemakers. To others, they were heroes. But to history, they became something greater, the spark that kept the flame alive. Their efforts led to real change. The Welsh Language Act of 1967 began to recognise the language's legal standing, and the establishment of S4C, the Welsh Language Television Channel, in 1982 gave it a powerful voice in modern media. For the first time in centuries, Welsh could be seen and heard not just in poetry or prayer, but in everyday life, on screens, in classrooms, in government halls. It was a small victory in the long war for identity, but in Wales, small victories have always meant survival. Yet the story was not without pain. The decline of heavy industry had gutted many Welsh communities. The mines that once roared with life went silent one by one, leaving behind unemployment, despair, and a sense of abandonment. Entire towns that had once defined the heartbeat of the nation were left hollow, their people struggling to find purpose in a world that had moved on. But through that silence, another transformation was taking place. The Welsh identity, long tied to the land and labour, began to reshape itself around culture, creativity, and connection. Musicians turned to the language as a form of rebellion, crafting songs that blended tradition with modern sound. Artists painted the old myths onto new canvases, while writers began to reimagine what it meant to be Welsh in a global world. The dragon that had once roared in battle now spoke through art, education, and the persistence of memory. In schools, the push for bilingual education became a movement of hope. Parents who had grown up forbidden to speak Welsh now demanded their children learn it. Immersion schools spread across the country, turning what was once a fading relic into a living language once more. By the dawn of the 21st century, the number of Welsh speakers had begun to rise again for the first time in generations. It was a quiet miracle, born not of conquest or decree, but of love, the simple, enduring love of a people for the sound of their own voice. And yet, beneath this revival lingered the old question that had haunted Wales for centuries. What does it mean to belong? The political landscape had begun to shift. In 1997, after decades of debate and activism, Wales voted narrowly in favour of devolution, leading to the creation of the National Assembly for Wales in 1999. For the first time in nearly 700 years, Wales had a form of self-government, a parliament where decisions could be made in its own name. The moment was both triumphant and fragile. It did not erase the centuries of subjugation or the deep divisions within Welsh society, but it marked the beginning of something newer, return of agency, however limited. The chamber in Cardiff Bay, with its sweeping glass and soft light, stood as a modern reflection of ancient dreams. The voices that filled it spoke both English and Welsh, a symbol of coexistence rather than conquest. And though the powers of the assembly were modest, the symbolism was immense. It was as if the ghosts of the princes watched from the hills, their long struggle finally finding a flicker of fulfillment. But the fight for identity never ends. In the globalized world of the 21st century, new challenges emerge: migration, media saturation, and the slow homogenization of culture. For a nation built on memory, these changes were both opportunity and threat. The young could now speak to the world, but would they still speak to their ancestors? Would the language that had survived the sword and the schoolroom survive the algorithm and the screen? For many, the answer lay in the same truth that had carried Wales through every storm: endurance. The Welsh spirit has never needed dominance to thrive, only space to breathe. Whether through protest or prayer, through art or activism, it continues to find new forms of expression. And in the hum of the cities, in the laughter of children learning their first Welsh words, and in the wind that still whispers across Snowdonia's peaks, the nation continues to speak. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but persistently, like the sound of the tide against the shore. Constant, eternal, and alive. The language had once seemed doomed to die, yet it endured. And in its endurance lies the soul of Wales itself, people who may bend, but never break. By the turn of the 20th century, Wales stood on the threshold of something both exhilarating and uncertain, a nation caught between the smoke of its past and the glimmer of an unformed future. The coal mines that once roared with life were now symbols of exhaustion. The same iron veins that had once pulsed with the heartbeat of the Industrial Revolution began to dry. Towns that had been built upon black gold now carried the quiet melancholy of decline. And yet, beneath this surface of soot and fatigue, something more delicate was stirring, an awakening not of industry, but of identity. The miners' lamps dimmed, but the flame of culture grew brighter. The chapels that once thundered with revival hymns began to echo with the voices of poets, teachers, and reformers. Wales was beginning to see itself differently, not merely as a labouring arm of an empire, but as a people with its own story, its own rhythm, and its own right to exist as a singular heartbeat within the British Isles. In the streets of Cardiff, new ideas were forming, ideas of equality, of language revival, of a national conscience shaped not by what was produced in the mines, but by what was preserved in the mind. Universities and newspapers carried these sparks, each one a small rebellion against the slow erasure of Welshness that had shadowed the last century. And perhaps the most remarkable thing of all was the resilience of the language. Though it had been pushed to the margins by law and economy, Welsh endured in homes, in prayer, and in the songs passed from one generation to another. In the early 20th century, when much of Europe was swept by nationalism, Wales found itself quietly, introspectively redefining what it meant to be a nation. It was not a nationalism of conquest or expansion, but of memory and dignity, a determination to remain visible in a world that often looked elsewhere. The Great War came, and with it, a sorrow too vast to measure. Thousands of Welsh men and boys left their valleys, their farms, their steel towns, to fight in lands they had never seen, for reasons that seemed distant from their own struggles. The loss was profound, and yet in that grief grew a strange kind of unity. When they returned, those who did return, they brought with them a sharper sense of belonging, a recognition that Wales was not merely a province of Britain, but a homeland that had paid its own price in blood. In the decades that followed, change swept across the land. The general strike of 1926, the collapse of coal prices, and the slow death of the industrial age left scars that ran deep through the valleys. Entire communities withered under the weight of unemployment and migration. But even in despair, there were echoes of defiance. Poets like Dylan Thomas and writers such as Cadoc Evans gave the world the voice of Wales, not through history books or political manifestos, but through art that pulsed with the ache and humour of ordinary life. Their words painted the landscape not as a backdrop, but as a living character, wild, wounded, and unyielding. As the 20th century unfolded, Wales began to demand a voice in its own governance. The dream of self-rule, long whispered by poets and preachers, began to find footing in the halls of politics. The establishment of the Welsh Office in 1964, and later the slow march toward devolution, marked not a sudden revolution, but a patient reawakening. Each step was small, yet each carried centuries of longing within it. Through the turbulence of modernization, the Welsh identity adapted it, absorbed new technologies, new industries, even new populations, but at its core remained something profoundly ancient. The sense that belonging was not about borders or armies, but about language, memory, and community. In schools, children once again began to learn in Welsh. In television and radio, the language found new life. The valleys that had once echoed with the rumble of coal trains now carried the softer hum of cultural revival. And amid all this, there was an unspoken truth that continued to shape the Welsh story, that endurance was not born of power, but of patience. Wales did not conquer. It endured. It did not demand. It remembered. And as the modern world swept forward, faster and louder with each passing decade, Wales carried on quietly, weaving its story into the greater fabric of human history, story of survival, not through domination, but through the unwavering act of remembering who it was. Yet, even as progress advanced, the question lingered, subtle but constant, carried on the wind from the Brecon beacons to the shores of Anglesey. What? After all, does it mean to be Welsh in a world that is forgetting how to remember? In the later decades of the 20th century, the identity of Wales entered a new and uncertain era. The smoke that once cloaked the valleys had lifted, revealing not prosperity, but a strange emptiness where industry once ruled. Rows of terraced houses still clung to the hillsides, but the mines beneath them were silent. The great furnaces were cold, their brickwork blackened ghosts of the industrial empire that had built modern Britain. Yet, out of this silence, Wales began to listen to itself again. There was a shift, subtle, cultural, and deeply human. People who had long been told their future was forged from iron began to rediscover that it was also made of words, song, and spirit. Across the country, voices rose in defense of the Welsh language, that ancient river of sound which had nearly been dammed by the machinery of empire. Activists chained themselves to railings, painted slogans across government buildings, and refused to be silent in courtrooms. They did not fight with weapons, but with words, with endurance, and with the conviction that a language is not just a tool of speech, is the very skeleton of identity. Out of these protests emerged a new confidence, one that eventually gave rise to S4C, the Welsh language television channel, and a generation who would grow up hearing their own voices reflected back through the media for the first time in centuries. It was not just language that was being reclaimed. It was self-worth. Artists, musicians, and writers began to shape a culture that was at once rooted in the soil and open to the world. The landscapes of Snowdonia and Pembrokeshire became more than postcards. They became emblems of belonging, symbols of a nation quietly reasserting itself not through grand declarations, but through daily acts of remembrance. The miners' strikes of the 1980s brought pain and defiance, especially in South Wales, where communities already scarred by economic hardship now faced extinction. But even in that darkness, the solidarity that emerged became almost a mythica, reminder that the Welsh spirit was forged not only in labour, but in shared struggle. Choirs still sang in the union halls. Families still gathered under the Red Dragon. English remained dominant, and the Welsh tongue still fought to survive, especially in urban centres. The balance between progress and preservation became delicate, and at times painful. But each generation, in its own way, took up the same question. How do you hold on to something ancient while walking into something new? In the art galleries of Cardiff, in the classrooms of Bangor, in the digital spaces where young Welsh speakers began to create online, the answer continued to shift but never disappear. Modern Wales was both memory and reinvention a nation, where the past and future touched like two tides meeting on the same shore. The steel and coal had gone, but the imagination remained, rich and defiant. And through it all, the landscape endured as witness. The hills still carried the marks of forgotten kingdoms. The valleys still echoed with the ghosts of choirs long disbanded. The wind that swept across the moors of Powys still sounded like an ancient voice whispering in two languages at once. As the 21st century dawned, Wales faced itself not as a relic of empire, not as a region of convenience, but as a question that still had no final answer. Could a nation so small in size, yet so vast in spirit, chart its own course in a world that seemed to shrink with every technological breath? Could the language that had survived conquest and industrialization now survive the quiet erosion of screens and convenience? These were not just political questions, they were existential ones. And perhaps, as always, Wales would answer them not with noise, but with endurance. Not by shouting, but by continuing to speak softly in its own tongue. Against the wind, as it has for 1,000 years. As the 21st century moved forward, Wales stood as a nation both ancient and newborn, an old soul awakening in a world of constant acceleration. The red dragon fluttered not only from castle walls and public buildings, but from digital avatars, art festivals, and global campaigns that reintroduced the name Cymru to a connected world. Yet beneath this proud resurgence lay quieter questions about identity, belonging, and the meaning of progress. In the gleaming cities of Cardiff and Swansea, steel and coal were replaced by glass towers, stadium lights, and tech hubs. The hum of data centers and the rhythm of commuter trains now filled the space once occupied by the clatter of mining tools and the hymnals of chapels. Progress had come, but it spoke a different language. And still, the echoes of the past refused to fade. The songs of the valleys were not forgotten. They simply adapted. Young musicians sampled folk melodies in electronic soundscapes. Poets posted in Welsh on social media, crafting verses that reached across oceans instead of chapel aisles. The language, fragile yet resilient, flowed once again through new channels. Each message, each lyric, each whispered phrase was an act of defiance against centuries of quiet erasure. For many, this was the heart of modern Welshness, not political autonomy or wealth, but the act of remembering in motion. Yet, even as the language revived, divisions deepened between rural and urban Wales. In the north and west, where Welsh was still spoken as a first tongue, life moved slower, tied to land and sea, two rhythms that had not changed in generations. In the cities, where opportunity gathered, English dominated, and global culture seeped through every screen and storefront. It was not a conflict of hostility, but of distance, an invisible rift between the Wales of memory and the Wales of motion. And so the struggle continued, not for independence in the traditional sense, but for coherence, for the right to remain distinctly Welsh in a world that demanded uniformity. The National Assembly evolved into the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, symbolizing not just authority, but identity. With each new election came debate about what it meant to govern a land so steeped in history and yet so entangled with modern Britain. Independence whispers returned. Some saw it as a dream, others as a distraction, but beneath all the politics lay something older and deeper, the desire to speak without translation, to live without compromise. In schools, Welsh medium education spread further, creating a new generation who could switch between two worlds with ease. They were bilingual in more than language, they were bilingual in time, fluent in the ancient and the modern, the local and the global. And as this generation grew, so too did the quiet revolution of awareness. The ruins of castles, once symbols of conquest, became classrooms of memory. The cold tips, once wounds upon the land, became memorials of endurance. History was no longer a burden, it was a mirror. The modern Welsh story became one of balance, between remembering and reinventing, between pride and humility. It was found in the festivals that celebrated not kings or wars, but words, the Eisteddfod, where poetry and song carried the same prestige once reserved for politics and battle. It was found in communities rebuilding after economic collapse, in farmers adopting sustainable traditions, in artists reimagining myths for the age of streaming. Wales, small as it was, became a landscape of paradoxes, a nation of quiet revolutionaries who changed the world not by domination, but by persistence. And through all of it, the land itself continued to shape its people. The mist that rolled through Snowdonia, the tides of the many strait, the stone paths winding through ancient forests all, these were reminders that time in Wales did not move in straight lines, but in circles. The same wind that touched the cheeks of medieval kings now brushed against students and poets who still carried the same sense of wonder, the same instinct to listen to the past. For those who visit, Wales may appear as a country of ruins and hillsides, of grey skies and green valleys, but to those who know it, it is alive with memory. Each ruin is a sentence in a story that never ended. Each village, each mountain, is a character speaking softly through the ages. And as the 21st century deepens, this small nation continues to pose a question larger than itself, in an age where everything is connected. Can a people remain themselves without being consumed by the world around them? Perhaps the answer lies not in power, but in patience, not in the roar of nations, but in the whisper of one that has always chosen endurance over empire. Wales endures because it listens. It remembers not to live in the past, but to carry it forward like a torch, lighting the long road ahead through the fog of time. And as the night deepens, somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a choir still drifts across the valise, a reminder that though the world may change, the song of Wales never truly ends. As the digital century unfolded, Wales found itself both preserved and transformed, its myths whispered through fiber-optic cables, its hillsides captured in drone footage, its history retold in countless voices across the web. The nation once known for its isolation was now connected to every corner of the earth. Yet somehow it remained apart, still defined by the strange gravity of its past. The same mist that once cloaked ancient stone circles now hung over wind farms and motorways, wrapping the modern landscape in a quiet melancholy that even technology couldn't erase. This was not the Wales of conquest or coal, but a country learning to live between worlds, between heritage and globalization, between nostalgia and necessity. The rhythm of life here still pulsed to old patterns, the seasons, the festivals, the hymns, but beneath it was a new beat, subtle but insistent, born from screens and cities, from the endless hum of modern connection. It was an age of rediscovery as much as invention. People began returning to the Welsh countryside, not as labourers, but as seekers drawn by its stillness, its wildness, its ability to remind them of something lost in the noise of the wider world. The mountains, once carved by industry, were now sanctuaries. The valleys, once black with coal, became green again. Nature itself seemed to reclaim what time had borrowed, and with it came a sense of renewal, as though the land was forgiving its people for the centuries of extraction. And yet, even in this renewal, there lingered a quiet unease, a recognition that survival had never come easily to Wales. Global economics, changing climates, and political tensions pressed in from all sides. The language, though revived, remained fragile, still battling the tide of convenience and assimilation. Some schools thrived in Welsh medium education, others struggled to find teachers fluent enough to keep the chain unbroken. Activists fought not for independence of state, but for independence of mind, for the right to exist in a world that often confused progress with erasure. The Senate debated, the people watched, and beneath it all, the same question echoed as it always had: who are we, and what are we becoming? To answer that, one had to look backward as much as forward. The myths of the Mabinogion were retold, not as fairy tales, but as psychological maps of the Welsh soul stories of transformation, sacrifice, and endurance. Artists painted Blodeuwedd in neon. Musicians turned the legend of Bran the Blessed into song. and filmmakers captured the strange tension between modern life and ancient memory that had always haunted this land. Even the ruins, once quiet symbols of loss, became part of the new narrative. Castles, cairns, and crumbling chapels stood like bookmarks in a vast story still being written. The line between the living and the historical blurred. Every town square and riverbank seemed to hum with invisible continuity. The Welsh understood, perhaps better than most, that the past was not behind them, but beneath them, layered, breathing, whispering, and in that understanding lay their strength. But progress demanded compromise, and compromise often came at a cost. Tourism grew, bringing with it wealth, but also dilution. English voices filled the coastal villages, once entirely Welsh-speaking, and housing prices climbed beyond reach for local families. Some saw this as the inevitable price of visibility, others as a quiet form of displacement. Yet even in frustration, the Welsh spirit found ways to adapt. Community festivals multiplied, local councils funded cultural initiatives, and grassroots movements worked to preserve the integrity of the landscape and the language. There was defiance in small acts, a bilingual sign repainted, a local band singing in Welsh at a global festival, a teacher refusing to let a dying dialect fade. These moments, small, human, persistent, were what kept the story alive. And through it all, the sense of mystery deepened rather than diminished. The more Wales modernized, the more its mythic aura seemed to grow. Perhaps it was the landscape itself, place where fog and rain made even the newest buildings look ancient, where time seemed to fold in on itself. Or perhaps it was the temperament of the people wary, lyrical, introspective, shaped by centuries of survival without conquest. To outsiders, Wales appeared tranquil, even forgotten. But those who listened closely could hear the pulse beneath the quiet, the heartbeat of a nation that had seen everything fall and still refused to vanish. In the cities, murals bloomed across old factory walls, bearing lines of poetry in languages half the world couldn't read but somehow felt. In the rural chapels, where attendance had waned, music found new purpose through choirs and concerts. The sacred and the secular intertwined as they always had. The same spirit that once filled cathedrals with hymns now filled bars and festivals with voices rising in harmony. It wasn't nostalgia, which continuity disguised as change. As night falls over modern Wales, the same shadows stretch across the same stones that have stood since before recorded time. The stars above Snowdonia shine over highways now, but their light is the same that guided saints, poets, and miners. Progress has come, but it has not erased the old Wales. It has simply folded it into a new layer of story, waiting for those who listen carefully enough to hear it. And perhaps that is the secret of this land, that its strength lies not in what it builds or owns, but in what it remembers. For even in silence, even in change, Wales endures, not as a relic, but as a reminder that identity, once truly rooted, can never be uprooted by time. The Wales of the present stands like a bridge between two worlds, one foot in the deep soil of myth, the other in the luminous haze of the digital age. It is a place that seems to move slower than the rest of the world, and yet it is never still. Every stone wall, every whispered hymn, every coastal wind carries both memory and transformation. To walk through Wales today is to walk through the strata of history itself, where the Bronze Age, the Industrial Age, and the Information Age coexist like overlapping dreams. In Cardiff, the Senedd rises in glass and steel, a symbol of modern governance shaped to reflect the openness of democracy. But just beyond it, The old docks recall the cries of sailors, the clatter of chains, the scent of coal and salt water. The air hums with the friction between what was and what will be. Yet beneath this modern exterior, something ancient continues to stir the quiet defiance that has always defined this land. It can be heard in the language of schoolchildren switching effortlessly between Welsh and English, in the songs that blend folk harps with electric guitars, in the writers who slip myths into stories about housing crises and politics. The Welsh imagination refuses to live entirely in the present. It insists on bringing the past along like a living companion. This is what makes Wales different. Does not discard what came before, it transforms it. The same rivers that once powered mills now generate clean energy, their flow unchanged. The same valleys that once echoed with strikes and sermons now hold festivals, the voices different but the rhythm the same. And through it all, the people remain bound by a subtle understanding that progress without memory is not progress at all. Yet this awareness does not make the journey easy. Economic disparity still haunts the land. The ghosts of lost industries casting long shadows over towns built for work that no longer exists. In places like Merthyr, Tydfil and Blanavon, history is both a monument and a burden preserved in museums and memorials, but also carried in the tired eyes of generations seeking purpose in a changed world. There is pride, yes, but also pain, and the knowledge that survival sometimes means learning to live with contradiction. The dream of independence, too, flickers sometimes bright, sometimes dim. Some see it as the inevitable culmination of centuries of endurance, others as a romantic illusion in a globalized economy. But perhaps independence, in the Welsh sense, was never solely about politics. Perhaps it was always about the right to imagine freely, to speak without translation, to exist without apology. The true independence of Wales lies in its ability to define itself on its own terms, to resist being reduced to a footnote or a curiosity, and in that sense it has already succeeded. Across art, sport, science, and activism, the Welsh presence grows stronger, not through aggression, but through authenticity. Its global sons and daughters artists, athletes, thinkers carry the same fierce gentleness that has always characterized this land, humble but unyielding, quiet but certain, and still the landscape remains the truest expression of the Welsh soul. The mountains of Eryri, the cliffs of Pembrokeshire, the moors of Brecon, they are not mere scenery. They are the memory of the nation made visible. To stand among them is to feel the centuries pressing close, to hear the language of the wind that no textbook could ever translate. It is this intimacy between people and place that has allowed Wales to survive when so many cultures have vanished. The land and the people mirror each other, enduring, adapting, never forgetting. Even the weather seems to carry the mood of the nation. Soft rain that blurs the line between sorrow and peace. Sudden sunlight that breaks through like revelation. In recent years, as the world grapples with identity, sustainability, and belonging, Wales has become something of a quiet teacher. Its smallness is its strength, its history a warning and a promise. The lessons are simple but profound, that community matters more than conquest, that culture is not preserved by isolation but by expression, that a language can be a lifeline, a map, and a shield all at once. In an era obsessed with speed, Wales offers stillness. In a time of noise, it offers song. Perhaps that is why so many who visit find themselves strangely haunted after they leave, as though the hills have whispered something they can't quite remember, but can't forget either. The story of Wales is not about victory or defeat, it is about continuity, about the art of remaining. Every generation inherits not just a nation, but a duty to keep the song alive, to add verses without erasing the old ones. And as twilight falls across the valleys and the mist rolls in from the sea, the world seems to pause for a moment, listening to the hum of this ancient, living land. Somewhere in the distance, a voice begins to sing in a language older than the empire, older than the steel, older than the silence itself. And in that song is everything, the grief, the endurance, the beauty, and the quiet power of a people who have learned not just to survive history, but to carry it like a flame through the dark. The story of Wales, as it enters the middle decades of the 21st century, feels less like a continuation and more like a renewal, steady pulse rising again beneath the noise of a restless world. The red dragon still flies, not merely as a symbol of resistance, but as a sign of persistence, an emblem of a nation that refuses to let time erode its voice. Yet this era, unlike those before it, is not defined by conquest or collapse, but by questions of language, of land, of belonging in a world where boundaries blur faster than ever before. The Welsh language, once suppressed and nearly extinguished, has begun to bloom again, fragile but resilient, like a flower pushing through stone. In classrooms across the country, children recite poems their ancestors might have whispered by candlelight, unaware that they are performing an act of rebellion simply by speaking. Street signs, advertisements, even social media posts now carry the rhythm of Cymraeg, transforming the language from an artifact into a living, breathing force. Yet with every gain comes uncertainty. Can a language survive not just as memory, but as daily life? Can an ancient identity thrive within a global conversation that values speed over depth and novelty over heritage? The people of Wales, ever introspective, grapple with this quietly, not through shouting, but through doing. Artists weave bilingualism into their music. Filmmakers capture the rural heartlands in slow, deliberate images that defy the frenzy of modern storytelling. Writers blend mythology with realism, crafting narratives that remind the world that Wales has always been a country of stories, not slogans. And through this creative rebirth, a deeper truth emerges that perhaps the modern challenge of Wales is not survival, but visibility. For centuries, it existed in the shadows of greater powers, shaped but not erased by them. Now, as those empires dissolve into history, Wales faces the delicate task of defining itself, not by contrast, but by essence. What does it mean to be Welsh when the world is watching? Some say it lies in the landscape, eternal partnership between people and place. In the north, the mountains of Eryri rise like the bones of the earth, ancient and unmoving, their mist-trapped peaks guarding stories that have outlasted dynasties. In the west, the coastline stretches wild and untamed, where cliffs crumble into grey seas that have carried traders, pilgrims, and invaders alike. Each tide, each gust of wind carries echoes of prayers and songs long vanished from human lips. The land remembers what people forget, and perhaps that is why the Welsh still feel their nation through their senses more than their laws. Others believe the answer lies in the rhythm of community, the way life here still folds around shared spaces. From local pubs and village halls to digital gatherings that carry the same warmth in virtual form, there is a humility in the Welsh way of being, a resistance to the arrogance of certainty. Progress is welcomed, but never at the expense of belonging. This careful balance between movement and memory has made Wales both timeless and timely, rooted and restless, ancient and young all at once. Yet modern challenges loom large. The climate crisis threatens coastlines and farmlands. Rural depopulation leaves villages hollow where once they hummed with laughter and hymn. The urban sprawl of Cardiff and Swansea stretches further each year, threatening to pull the heart from the countryside. And still, amid these pressures, the Welsh spirit bends but does not break. Communities adapt. Farmers turn to sustainability. Local councils invest in cultural preservation. Musicians organize festivals, not just for entertainment, but for remembrance. Each small act becomes a thread in the greater fabric of endurance that has always defined this nation. Beyond its borders, the Welsh diaspora scattered across the world carry their homeland in memory and language, rekindling its stories in places as distant as Patagonia, North America, and Australia. Their gatherings, their songs, their accents softened by foreign air yet unmistakably Welsh, remind the world that identity is not tied to geography but to consciousness. Wherever the Welsh voice speaks, Wales exists. And so, the 21st century version of this nation is not confined to the map, lives in the imagination. Perhaps that is where its true immortality lies. For what is Wales, if not a place of imagination made real? A land where history and myth walk side by side, where poets were once lawmakers and songs were weapons stronger than steel. In a century obsessed with innovation, Wales stands as a quiet paradox, modern but meditative, forward-looking yet still listening for the echoes of its own beginnings. As night settles over the valleys, the glow of wind turbines replaces the old mining lamps, and the sound of the wind over slate takes the place of hammer and pick. Yet the feeling is the same, the pulse of labour, the rhythm of endurance, the hush of something greater than progress. The world rushes ahead, but Wales endures in its own time, slower, deeper, more human. Perhaps that is its greatest act of resistance, to remain itself while the world forgets how. And in that stillness, in that patience, there is something eternal, something sacred. Because Wales does not shout its existence, it hums it softly, endlessly, like the note that lingers long after the song has ended. The soul of Wales is not found in monuments or palaces, but in silence, in the mist that drifts through the valleys at dawn, in the low hum of the sea against the cliffs of Pembrokeshire, in the echo of footsteps across cobbled streets still wet with rain. It is a silence heavy with memory, as if the land itself remembers too much and dares not speak it aloud. In this silence, the Welsh people have always found their voice, one born not of conquest but of endurance. For centuries, Wales was a whisper beneath empires, its language forbidden, its culture dismissed as quaint or provincial. Yet through that suppression, something profound took root, at defiance that did not scream but sang. The Welsh learned that survival could be a kind of rebellion, that beauty itself could be an act of resistance. This defiance runs through every song, every tale, every carved stone and weathered chapel. It is the same defiance that once drove poets to write in secret and preachers to hold their sermons on desolate hillsides, where only the wind bore witness. It is the same pulse that turned miners into choirs, their voices echoing through the black tunnels of the earth as though they were singing to something eternal. That same music, though transformed by time, still reverberates through modern Wales. It can be heard in the voices of children learning old songs anew, in the booming stadiums where thousands sing not in defiance but in pride, in the quiet classrooms where a teacher insists on a word's true pronunciation, because to mispronounce it would be to let go of history itself. Yet, The challenge of modern Wales is not only to remember, but to transform memory into motion. The digital age threatens to flatten cultures into content, to turn languages into curiosities rather than living entities. The world scrolls too quickly to listen, and yet Wales insists on being heard in its own tempo. Projects arise to digitize old manuscripts, to record elders speaking the dialects of the valleys before those voices vanish, to teach coding through Cymraeg so that the language evolves alongside technology instead of being crushed beneath it. The old bards, if they could see it, would recognize the spirit even if the form is new. For theirs was a culture not afraid of change, but only of forgetting. The people of Wales have always known that identity is not a museum, but a river it must flow to stay alive. That is why the landscapes still hold such power here. They are not backgrounds, but participants in the story. The mountains, the forests, the stone walls dividing fields, they are the keepers of continuity. Generations pass, languages evolve, governments change, but the land remains the constant, whispering its own language beneath human noise. Farmers still walk the same ridgelines their ancestors did, not as tourists in history, but as custodians of it. To be Welsh is to feel that weight, the understanding that every step you take has already been taken by someone who dreamed and struggled as you do. And perhaps that is why the sense of loss feels sharper here. The closure of a mine, the fading of a village, the death of a language, these are not just social events, but wounds to something spiritual. The Welsh carry their past not as nostalgia, but as inheritance. Each story told, each song sung, each monument tended is a repayment of that debt. But Wales does not merely dwell on what has been lost. In recent decades, a quiet revolution has unfolded, one rooted in creativity and reclamation. Filmmakers have begun to turn the myths of the Mabinogion into psychological explorations of identity and trauma. Musicians have blended ancient folk melodies with electronic rhythms, creating something neither old nor new but unmistakably. Welsh artists have taken the scars of industry, the rusting structures, the abandoned railways, and turned them into canvases for rebirth. Even the political sphere reflects this shift. Devolution was not simply a matter of governance, but a voice reclaiming of the right to define one's own narrative. And though debates continue over independence and unity, they are fueled not by bitterness, but by belief. Belief that Wales deserves to choose its path, to shape its story, to stand as itself rather than as an echo of others. Yet this confidence remains gentle, introspective, shaped by centuries of humility. The Welsh do not shout their nationalism in slogans. They build it in schools, in song, in community. Theirs is a patriotism that grows from the soil up, not the flag down. And as the world turns ever more chaotic, that groundedness may be their greatest strength. For while others chase noise and spectacle, Wales holds fast to rhythm and reason. In the quiet of its hills and the depth of its songs lies something the modern world has forgotten, that to endure is not to stagnate, but to remain faithful to essence even as form changes. And perhaps that is why Wales still feels ancient even when it innovates, because every new step is taken with an awareness of the past. Every modern voice carries an ancestral echo. The red dragon, after all, is not a symbol of power, but of presence. It does not conquer, it endures. It guards, it watches, it waits. And so does Wales, ever ancient, ever new, suspended between memory and becoming, its silence not emptiness but prayer. Night descends over the Welsh valleys, not with darkness, but with a soft silver light that seems to rise from the earth itself. the mist rolls down from the mountains, weaving between stone cottages and slate roofs, carrying with it the scent of rain and heather. This is the hour when the land feels oldest, when time folds in on itself and past and present blur. You can almost hear the echoes of miners returning home, their boots heavy with coal dust, mingling with the voices of medieval shepherds calling to their flocks on distant hills. Wales has always existed in this twilight between eras, a country where ghosts are not feared but remembered, in the shadows of abandoned collieries and crumbling castles. The heartbeat of the nation still pulses, steady, resilient, patient. The 20th century brought Wales into a new kind of conflict, not fought with swords or cannons, but with ideas, identity, and survival in a world that moved faster than ever before. The industrial heart that had once powered empires began to falter. Mines closed, factories fell silent, and the valleys that had once glowed with the orange fire of furnaces sank into darkness. For many, it was as if the sun had gone out, both literally and spiritually. Communities that had thrived on shared purpose, digging, building, creating, were left to rediscover who they were when the machines stopped. But from that loss came something remarkable, a rebirth of consciousness. The Welsh people began to turn inward, not in despair, but in reflection. They asked themselves what it truly meant to be Welsh without the labour that had defined their existence for generations. And slowly the answer emerged, not in industry, but in imagination. Poets like R.S. Thomas began to capture the quiet tragedy and stubborn hope of the rural heartland. His verses, sparse and haunting, painted Wales as both wound and wonder, a place both betrayed and beautiful. Artists turned back to the land, to the sea, to the ancient myths that had once defined the psyche of their people. The story of Blodeuwedd, the woman made of flowers, became not just a myth, but a metaphor for identity built from fragility. The tale of Bran, the blessed crossing the sea, with his severed head speaking wisdom, became a parable of endurance through loss. Even in cinema, the Welsh landscape became a character unto itself, wild, melancholic, unyielding. Directors captured the slow decay of mining towns, the resilience of communities that refused to vanish, and the raw poetry of a people who found meaning in smallness. This cultural renaissance was not loud. It whispered its way into being, like the slow turning of the tide. And as it grew, so too did the movement to preserve the language, the lifeblood of Welsh identity. Cymreg, once mocked and suppressed, began to re-emerge in schools, in public life, in media. It was no longer a relic of the past, but a living, breathing tongue that could shape the future. Young people began to speak it not out of duty, but out of pride. They wrote songs in it, filmed short stories in it, and texted their friends in it. Technology, once seen as a threat to small languages, became an unlikely ally. Apps taught Welsh to new generations. Podcasts explored its poetic depths, and online communities connected speakers across oceans. The dragon was learning to breathe in the digital age. Yet this renewal did not erase the pain of what had been lost. The scars of deindustrialization still marked the land, the empty factories, the forgotten railways swallowed by weeds. But in Wales, scars are not meant to be hidden. They are part of the story. Villagers began to transform their past into power, turning former collieries into museums, art centres, and memorials. Each one stood not as a monument to failure, but as a testament to transformation. The spirit that once fueled labour now fueled creation. And as the 21st century dawned, a new generation began to see Wales not as a country on the edge of Britain, but as a heart of its own world. Environmental movements rooted in Welsh respect for land and sustainability began to shape policy. The Welsh Parliament, born from centuries of deferred self-determination, became a voice for balance, a blend of ancient values and modern vision. In the classrooms, children learned about the Celts and the coal mines with equal reverence, understanding that both the mythic and the industrial were chapters of the same story. Even religion, long central to Welsh identity, evolved into new spiritual expressions, some found in chapels, others in art, music, and environmental activism. For the first time in centuries, Wales began to define itself not through struggle, but through choice. Yet the most powerful thing about modern Wales is its quiet. In a world addicted to speed and spectacle, Wales moves at its own pace. Its strength is not in dominance, but in depth. It teaches that identity is not something to be broadcast, but something to be lived. That perhaps the greatest rebellion against an ever noisier world is to speak softly and mean every word. And so the land continues to breathe its slow, sacred rhythm. The rivers still sing the same songs they did in the time of the Druids. The hills still glow gold in the light of late summer. And beneath the surface, in the language, in the music, in the collective memory, something eternal stirs a reminder that the story of Wales is not one of survival against the odds, but of belonging so deeply to the world that even time cannot erase it. For Wales does not end. It continues, like the tide, like the song always returning, always reminding us that history is not gone, it only sleeps. If you stand at the edge of Snowdonia just before dawn, when the mist still curls low and the air carries that metallic scent of dew, you can almost hear the centuries breathing. The stones beneath your feet were once walked by Roman legions, by shepherds herding flocks, by rebels and kings and poets who dreamed the same impossible dream that Wales might one day be heard as it truly is, not as others define it. In that silence, you feel it, the quiet defiance that has always shaped this land. The wind moving through the heather whispers old words, Simreg syllables, soft as water, and the hills seem to listen. Here, history does not lie buried beneath the ground. It rises from it, patient, waiting to be remembered. And when the first light strikes the peaks of Eryri, it feels like the world is waking up inside an ancient memory. The story of modern Wales is, in many ways, the story of remembering. Not nostalgia, not longing for what cannot return, but the deliberate act of recalling who you are in a world that constantly asks you to forget. The 21st century brought challenges unlike any before: globalization, digital fragmentation, economic pressures that made many nations lose themselves in the noise. But Wales, shaped by silence and endurance, responded differently. It began not with revolution, but with restoration. Artists returned to the rootswood, slate, song, soil, crafting beauty from the raw materials of identity. Musicians sampled the sound of the wind against old quarry walls, blending it with electronic harmonies that made the ancient pulse with life again. Writers turned to the myths of the Mabinogion and reimagined them in modern settings, finding in those ancient tales of transformation the same struggles of the present: love, loss, freedom, belonging. The Welsh landscape itself became a collaborator in this creative renewal. The hills and valleys, long mined and scarred, now became sanctuaries for imagination. Festivals like Eisteddfod evolved from gatherings of poets into vast celebrations of language, culture, and art, where teenagers with guitars and elders with harps shared the same stage. In these moments, time dissolved. The spirit of Taliesin, the ancient bard, seemed to linger in every lyric, every note. "The past is not behind us," one performer said. "It's inside us, waiting to sing." Yet even as culture thrived, Wales faced another struggler, quieter one, perhaps, but no less defining: the balance between preservation and progress. For some, the old ways felt too fragile to be touched. For others, they had to evolve or vanish. The question was not whether Wales could survive, but how it could do so without becoming a museum of itself. Some looked to the language as the key. They argued that Cymraeg, if spoken boldly in boardrooms and broadcast studios, could carry the nation into the future without losing its soul. Others believed it was the land itself, the mountains, the coastlines, the rural rhythms that gave Wales its identity. Still others said it was the spirit of community, that ancient Welsh notion of CY-DeFi living together that truly defined the nation. And perhaps they were all right. For Wales has always been many things at once: rural and industrial, mystical and modern, proud and self-questioning. Its strength has never been in uniformity but in harmony, in the ability to hold contradictions without breaking. This paradox, this capacity to be both rooted and restless is what makes the Welsh story so enduring. Even politics reflected this quiet balance. The Senedd in Cardiff became a symbol of autonomy not built on confrontation but on calm conviction. It stood like a beacon of transparency and dialogue, open and glass-walled, a contrast to the iron and stone of older power. Inside, debates about the environment, education, and the future of the Welsh language unfolded with a kind of patience rare in the modern age. Change came not through shouting, but through listening, a revolutionary idea in itself. And through all this, the people of Wales continued to live their lives with the same rhythm that has guided them for centuries: steady, melodic, bound to the seasons. Farmers still rose before dawn to tend their fields. Musicians still filled the pubs with harmonies that turned strangers into kin. Children still learned stories of dragons and saints that reminded them that their land was older than history itself. Wales may have entered the modern world, but it did so without surrender. It carried its myths like lanterns, lighting its way forward. In the global stage, Welsh voices began to reach further through literature, through music, through the quiet charisma of those who spoke not to dominate but to share. There was something disarming about that gentleness, that refusal to play the game of grandeur. It was as if the world, exhausted by noise, was finally ready to hear the soft strength of this small nation. Yet even now, as Wales stands at the crossroads of past and future, a question lingers in the mist. Can a culture so deeply tied to silence, to place, to language, survive in a world of constant motion? The answer, perhaps, lies not in certainty but in faith, the same faith that carried the bards through persecution, the miners through darkness, the teachers through decades of neglect. It is the faith that even if the world forgets, the land remembers. And so, as the dawn breaks over Snowdonia, as the light touches the stones that have seen 1,000 generations rise and fall, you realize something profound. Wales does not need to shout to be heard. It speaks in the language of endurance, in the song of rain against slate, in the sigh of wind through the valleys. It is a reminder that history's greatest power lies not in conquest or empire, but in quiet persistence, the kind that outlasts everything. As the morning spreads across the coast of Cardigan Bay, the light catches the water like molten silver, and the waves roll in as though carrying messages from centuries past. The sea has always been Wales' oldest companions, sometimes a protector, sometimes a thief, always a mirror to its soul. The tides have seen Roman galleys, Viking longships, Norman traders, and the black hulls of coal barges leaving for the far corners of empire. But as the 20th century faded into the 21st, those same waves began to whisper a new story, one not of conquest or commerce, but of return. The Welsh, scattered by centuries of emigration, began to turn their gaze homeward. In cities across the world, from Patagonia to Pennsylvania, descendants of miners, farmers, and dreamers started to reconnect with their ancestral land. They came seeking not riches or fame, but belonging. Digital archives opened doors that distance had long closed. Ancient parish records, now online, became bridges between worlds. Families rediscovered lost surnames, old songs, and the stories of those who had left to find what Wales could not yet give. It was as if the diaspora, long silent, had begun to sing again. The homeland was listening. This quiet homecoming mirrored a deeper cultural awakening within Wales itself. No longer content to define itself as the other within the British Isles, Wales began to articulate its own narrative. Universities championed Welsh literature and history as global subjects rather than regional curiosities. Filmmakers turned the camera inward, capturing the raw beauty of rural life, the ghostly grandeur of abandoned mining towns, the quiet dignity of communities rebuilding themselves after loss. These stories were not grand in scale, but they were immense in meaning, testaments to resilience without spectacle. The land, too, became a voice in this rebirth. Environmental consciousness took deep root in the national psyche. The old coal towns, once symbols of progress, became centers for renewable innovation. Wind farms crowned the ridges where slag heaps once stood, their white blades turning like prayers in the wind. Some saw irony in this, the land that had been stripped bare, now healing itself, but others saw poetry. It was as if the mountains were breathing again. Even in this transformation, the old reverence for nature persisted, echoing the Celtic belief that the divine is woven into the world around us. Sacred wells and standing stones drew quiet pilgrims once more, not in superstition, but in search of stillness. Modern druids, environmentalists, and ordinary citizens gathered to honor the solstices and the seasons, not as nostalgia, but as a way of remembering that time here moves in circles, not lines. And amid this spiritual reawakening, the Welsh language continued its slow, miraculous resurgence. Schools where once English alone was spoken now rang with Cymraeg laughter. Street signs, once replaced, were restored to their true names. Even technology bent to the will of the language voice assistants learned to understand Welsh. Online games appeared with bilingual options, and Welsh memes filled social media feeds. A people once told their tongue was dying, now found it breathing stronger than ever. It wasn't just a means of communication. It was an act of defiance, a whisper of continuity in a world obsessed with novelty. Yet this new Wales, reborn from its scars, was not untouched by the world beyond its borders. Economic disparity lingered, old class divides persisted, and the question of independence, long a murmured dream, grew louder in uncertain times. The idea of self-determination, once dismissed as romantic fantasy, began to sound less like rebellion and more like necessity. Still, the debate was different, here measured, poetic, grounded in compassion rather than fury. Where others shouted, Wales reflected. Where others built walls, Wales built understanding. Its politics, though imperfect, carried a rare gentleness, a belief that unity need not erase individuality. And perhaps this was the essence of the Welsh spirit all along, to resist domination not through violence, but through persistence, to assert identity not through superiority, but through song. In an age when nations crumbled beneath the weight of their own pride, Wales offered something subtler, more enduring, model of quiet strength. Walk through its towns today, and you can feel this balance alive in the air. In Cardiff, glass towers rise beside Victorian arcades where the scent of fresh bread still mingles with the sea breeze. In the valleys, murals bloom across brick walls, miners painted as saints, schoolchildren holding torches of memory. In the countryside, ancient cottages hum with solar power, their chimneys still puffing smoke from hearths that have burned for centuries. It is a place where the past and future do not compete, they converse. Every aspect of life seems to carry the same refrain. Remember who you are, but keep walking forward. And as the sun dips low over the Irish Sea, casting the land in amber light, it's impossible not to feel that Wales has found something rare, a harmony between endurance and evolution. The dragon still flies, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. It guards not gold or territory, but meaning. For in the end, that is what Wales has always been, a keeper of meaning in a world too quick to forget. And as night falls again over the cliffs and valleys, the wind begins to sing, low and ancient. It carries a promise, soft but unbreakable, that the song of this land will never end. It will echo through time, through the hills and hearts of all who listen, reminding them that some stories are not meant to fade. They are meant to be lived forever. There is a peculiar magic that lingers in the air of Wales at twilight. The hour when the sky turns the colour of bruised slate and the mountains seem to hum with an unseen pulse. It's a magic that belongs to no era, for it carries the weight of thousands of years, and yet it feels as alive as the wind that bends the heather. Standing on a ridge above the River Towy, one could almost believe the land itself is conscious, watching quietly as history continues to unfold across its surface. It has watched Romans march and vanish, watched miners dig and falter, watched dreamers rise and fall, and yet through it all Wales endures. To understand why is to grasp something essential about human resilience. Wales has never relied on power to survive. It has relied on memory. Even in the modern age, that memory shapes the rhythm of daily life, where every act, no matter how ordinary, carries echoes of something ancient. The language, the music, the storytelling, they form an invisible architecture stronger than any fortress. This endurance is not accidental. It is born from centuries of struggle, yes, but also from an unusual harmony between people and place. The Welsh do not simply inhabit their land, they converse with it. The hills are not obstacles, but guardians. The rivers not boundaries, but guides. When industry collapsed and politics shifted, it was this bond that kept the soul of the nation intact. And so, in recent decades, a quiet transformation began, not imposed from above, but grown from the ground up. Local communities, once dismissed as relics of a bygone age, began to take charge of their own destinies. Villages reclaimed abandoned schools and turned them into cultural centres. Farmers formed cooperatives to protect traditional methods while embracing sustainability. The idea of Cymriacdwd, Welshness, evolved from a static identity into a living movement, fluid and inclusive, welcoming all who wished to belong. This rebirth was not loud or fast. It unfolded like the changing of seasons, steady and inevitable. In towns like Machynlleth and Aberystwyth, creativity became a form of resistance. Artists painted murals of mythic figures alongside portraits of miners and mothers, reminding everyone that history is not linear but cyclical. Poets and musicians fused the old with the new, singing in both Welsh and English, not as compromise but as expansion. The message was clear: Wales is not small, it is infinite in spirit. This idea began to ripple outward. Tourists came not only to see castles or coastlines, but to feel something intangible, the peace of belonging to a place that remembers itself. Academics began to study Welsh cultural resilience as a phenomenon, a model for how smaller nations could thrive in an age of globalization without surrendering their uniqueness. And in the heart of this movement stood the language Cymric, resilient, melodic, unyielding. It had been predicted to die 100 times, yet each generation seemed to breathe new life into it. Radio stations, podcasts, and YouTube channels in Welsh began to flourish. Children who once felt shy speaking it in public now rapped and wrote poetry in it. Teachers no longer fought to justify bilingual education. It had become a source of national pride. The language was no longer just a tool for communication. It was a declaration of continuity, proof that some things cannot be erased by time or conquest. Yet, even as pride grew, so did humility. Wales did not forget its hardships. The wounds of the industrial age, the poverty that had driven generations away, the loss of entire communities, all these remained in the national memory like shadows at the edge of light. But instead of bitterness, there was reverence. The scars were not seen as shameful but sacred, reminders that beauty can emerge from suffering. And perhaps that is why modern Wales feels different from anywhere else in the world, because it has made peace with its ghosts. It does not deny them. It walks beside them. When a choir sings in an old mining chapel, when a young poet recites lines inspired by a druid's prayer, when the wind carries the sound of bells across the valleys, it feels as though the living and the dead are keeping time together. This blending of past and present is not nostalgia, it's renewal. It reminds the listener that time itself bends around memory, and that some songs never stop playing. As the 21st century unfolds, Wales continues to balance on this threshold between preservation and progress. It stands as both guardian and guide, a reminder that the soul of a people cannot be measured in population or power, but in persistence. While other nations chase speed and dominance, Wales moves with deliberation, each step echoing with meaning. It teaches quietly that perhaps the purpose of history is not to glorify the victors, but to give voice to those who endured. And as night falls once again, and the mist settles thick across the valleys, you can almost hear that voice's soft hum beneath the world's noise, steady as a heartbeat, eternal as the tide. It whispers a truth the world too often forgets, that identity, when rooted in land, language, and love, is unbreakable. That a nation does not die when its kings fall or its empires fade, but only when it forgets to dream. And Wales, still dreaming, still singing, remains awake in that twilight between past and future, small country, perhaps, but an infinite story still being told. The deeper one listens to the story of Wales, the more it begins to sound like a heartbeat, the steady rhythm of endurance beneath centuries of noise and silence, glory and grief. And as the modern world races toward uncertainty, Wales seems to move in the opposite direction, not retreating but returning, circling back to its roots in order to move forward. There is a strange wisdom in that choice, one that much of the world has forgotten. In an age obsessed with innovation, Wales reminds us that the truest form of progress is remembering who you are. The land itself seems to embody that principle. Its hills are not just geological formations, they are keepers of continuity. They have watched the rise of industry and its fall into rust, watched new roads carve through old fields, watched the slow reclaiming of silence where machines once screamed. Nature, it seems, has taken back what was borrowed, but in doing so, it has not erased the past. You can still see the outlines of old mining shafts hidden under bracken. The ruins of chapels where voices once filled the air with hymns that shook the soul. These remnants are not dead, they are sleeping, humming with residual memory, as though the ground itself breathes in rhythm with those who came before. In the towns that cling to the valleys, there is a quiet defiance. People speak of community not as nostalgia, but as necessity. Pubs double as meeting halls, schools as cultural centers, and every festival feels like both a celebration and a protest against forgetfulness, against disconnection. The Eisteddfod, that grand annual gathering of poets, musicians, and dreamers, still feels like a sacred rite. Beneath the laughter and color, there's a pulse of something older, almost Pagana belief that language and art are forms of survival. To stand on that stage and speak in Welsh is not merely to perform. It is to reaffirm existence. That, perhaps, is what sets Wales apart. While many cultures measure themselves in terms of economic growth or global influence, Wales measures itself in memory, how much of its essence it can carry forward without dilution. And yet, it is not trapped in the past. The new generation of Welsh creators have found ways to bridge myth and modernity, weaving ancient motifs into film, literature, and design. Musicians remix traditional folk melodies with electronic textures. Painters blend Celtic symbolism with post-industrial decay. The result is something hauntingly new, a vision of Wales that is neither backward-looking nor entirely modern, but timeless. In this creative evolution lies a profound truth, that identity is not a relic but a river. It changes shape as it moves, but its source remains pure. This realization has also led to a cultural awakening beyond art. Politically and socially, Wales has begun redefining its relationship with power. The old dependence on external authorities, be they English, industrial or imperial, has slowly given way to a model of self-determination rooted in empathy and equality. The Welsh Parliament, though young, reflects this ethos. Debates about sustainability, education, and cultural preservation are not framed in abstract policy language, but in moral terms. The land and people are seen as one system, each decision measured by how it sustains life, not profit. In this way, Wales has become a quiet pioneer of a more humane politics. The world rarely notices, because Wales does not shout, it sings. It persuades not through dominance, but through dignity. That dignity is reflected in small, unnoticed acts. A community restoring an old railway line for love rather than money. A group of volunteers rebuilding a seawall after a storm. A teacher staying late to help a child pronounce an ancient word correctly. These moments do not make headlines, but they define the character of a nation. They reveal a people who have learned that resilience is not noise, it is persistence in silence. Even the landscape seems to echo that lesson. On a misty morning, when the valleys are veiled and the mountains seem to dissolve into cloud, it's easy to believe that Wales exists in two worlds at once, the tangible and the mythic. The ruins of Dorwydlan Castle stand not just as stone but as memory embodied, while the forests whisper of gods that once walked among mortals. There is no clear boundary between history and legend here because both serve the same purpose, to keep the soul awake. That is why those who come to Wales often describe feeling something inexplicably, a sense of recognition, as though the land is not new to them, but remembered. Perhaps it's because Wales speaks to something universal in the human spirit, that yearning for belonging, for meaning, for continuity in a world of erasure. Its power lies not in wealth or might, but in its refusal to vanish. Each generation, no matter how modern, seems to hear the same call. Co-fit remember. And they do. They remember the songs their grandparents sang, the stories whispered by firelight, the taste of salt air and coal dust, the way the hills turn gold at dusk. These are not just details. They are the threads of identity. They hold Wales together more tightly than any border or law ever could. And so, as night falls again over the valleys and the stars rise above Snowdonia, the heartbeat continues steady, ancient, undefeated. Somewhere in the dark, a choir begins to sing, and the sound rolls across the land like thunder softened by tenderness. It is the sound of a people who have survived everything time could throw at them, and who still, against all odds, believe in the beauty of their own story. If you stand at the edge of a Welsh cliff at dawn, where the sea breathes against the stone and the wind carries whispers from centuries past, you can almost hear the chorus of time, the overlapping voices of druids and miners, kings and preachers, poets and wanderers, all merging into one eternal sound. This is the heartbeat of Wales, an echo that refuses to fade even as the modern world hums louder around it. For here, history does not lie buried, it lingers, woven into the mist, stitched into the soil, alive in the language that still flows from tongue to tongue. Each word in Welsh feels like a spell, a survival chant that has crossed through fire and empire. It is not a language of convenience, but of conviction, carved from the land itself. To speak it is to draw breath from the same air that once filled the lungs of medieval bards who sang to kings and gods alike. Yet this continuity did not come easily. The 19th and 20th centuries tested the Welsh identity like never before. Industrialization had transformed valleys into veins of steel and coal, and while prosperity came, it came with a cost. The soot that darkened the skies also began to darken the spirit. Communities that had once lived by rhythm and nature now lived by the clock and the machine. Still, even amid the harsh clang of factories, something sacred endured. The chapel hymns rose above the mechanical noise like a counterspell, carrying messages of endurance and equality. When the mines closed and the machinery fell silent, the people turned once again to the oldest inheritance they possessed, their voice. It was in that silence, after the collapse of industry, that Wales rediscovered its own pulse. Art and song filled the void left by labour, and the land began to heal, slowly, tenderly. The rivers that once ran black cleared again, the forests crept back into the scars left by quarries, and the people began to ask not what have we lost, but what have we kept? That question became the cornerstone of a new Welsh awakening, one rooted not in nostalgia but in reclamation. This was the era of poets who turned pain into prophecy, of musicians who carried the weight of memory into new forms. They sang not only of what had been, but of what could be. Wales, they reminded the world, had always been a place of imagination, as much as reality a realm where myth and memory are the same currency. In the quiet villages, bilingual schools emerged, teaching children that identity is not a choice between past and present, but a bridge between both. They grew up learning to see the valleys not as relics of ruin, but as sacred ground. Slowly, the world began to take notice. Welsh cinema, literature, and politics began to speak with their own distinct voice. This was not the loud assertion of a small nation desperate for recognition, but the steady confidence of a people who no longer needed permission to exist. And yet, the mystery remained. Why does this land, small and often overlooked, command such deep emotion in those who visit or belong to it? Some say it is because of the landscape itself, which seems alive with sentience. The mountains are not mere stone, they feel like guardians, keeping watch over those who remember. The valleys do not merely echo sound, they cradle it, as if the songs sung there centuries ago are still vibrating in the air. Others believe it is something more spiritual, that the land holds the residue of ancient belief, a thin veil between the visible and the unseen. There are places where time feels uncertain standing, stones that hum in the twilight, forests that seem to breathe, ruins that hold warmth long after sunset. In those moments, you understand that the story of Wales is not linear. It moves in circles, in songs, in seasons. Each generation adds a new verse to the old melody, but the core remains the same: a devotion to memory, to belonging, to beauty even in hardship. This devotion extends beyond the spiritual into the political, too. Wales's ongoing struggle for autonomy is not fueled by anger or ambition, but by something gentler yet more powerful: the belief that small nations, like small voices, deserve to sing their own truth. Every debate about devolution, language, rights, or land protection is really about that single word, Cofitch. Remember who we are. Remember where we come from. Remember what was almost lost. And so the story continues, each era reshaping the melody but never erasing it. As you travel through modern Wales, you see it everywhere: in the murals painted on old brick walls, in the bilingual road signs that point both to the future and the past, in the laughter of children who speak to tongues as easily as breathing. The rhythm of the nation is softer now, less defined by industry and empire, more by resilience and grace. And when night comes, when the lights of the villages flicker like stars scattered across the valleys, you can feel it again: the pulse beneath the silence, the quiet declaration that Wales endures. For in every stone and story, in every song and shadow, this land whispers the same timeless promise that memory, when guarded with love, becomes its own kind of immortality. And as long as someone remembers, Wales will never fade. Because to remember Wales is to remember the soul of what it means to endure. There is a certain stillness that settles over Wales in the late hours, when the world falls quiet and only the distant sound of the sea carries through the valleys. It is then that the true spirit of the land seems to awaken, not through noise or grandeur, but through presence. The mountains stand like ancient sentinels, their silhouettes etched against the dim horizon, as if guarding the collective memory of a people who have survived everything history could throw at them. It is in this silence that one begins to understand the essence of Wales, not as a place trapped in the past, but as a living echo that continues to resonate through time. The land remembers every footstep, every song, every word whispered into the wind. It remembers the druids who lit sacred fires under oak trees, the poets who wove beauty from grief, the miners who descended into darkness with songs in their throats, and the mothers who kept the language alive at their kitchen tables when speaking it was forbidden. Each of these moments, fragile yet fierce, adds another layer to the Welsh soul. And what is remarkable is how this soul continues to express itself even as the modern age tries to drown it out. Today, the valleys hum with the quiet persistence of communities reinventing themselves. The old coal towns, once symbols of exhaustion and loss, are slowly transforming into sanctuaries of art, education, and cultural revival. The empty chapels that once held the thunder of revivalist hymns now echo with choirs rehearsing for the westward, or with artists painting scenes that blend memory and myth. The Welsh spirit has never been about resisting change. It has been about reshaping it, molding every new era into something that can coexist with the old. The same coal that once powered empires now fuels stories, symbols, and songs. Every ruin, every abandoned rail line, has become part of a larger narrative proof that decay, too, can be beautiful when it carries meaning. And meaning, above all, is what Wales has always preserved. You can feel it in the air, in the rhythm of the rain, in the cadence of Welsh speech, where even the simplest phrase carries centuries of poetry. In that language lies the key to everything. It is the vessel of the people's endurance, the thread that binds the ancient with the new. To lose it would be to lose the heartbeat of the land itself. That is why, in classrooms across the country, children are learning not just vocabulary, but identity. They are learning how to think in a language that does not simply describe the world, but shapes it. For Welsh is not a language of convenience. It is one of connection. Its structure, its rhythm, its song-like tonal remind the speaker that every word has roots, that no idea exists without history. And so, as the world races toward digital abstraction and algorithmic speech, Wales quietly reaffirms the sacredness of words. Words, after all, are what saved them, words spoken in defiance, written in exile, sung in prayer. Every generation of Welsh people has known what it means to defend a language not with weapons, but with willpower. And that endurance has made them philosophers of patience. Perhaps that is why Wales feels so calm, so timeless. The land teaches you that everything worthwhile takes time. Mountains form slowly. Songs mature over lifetimes, and nations are built not in conquest, but in quiet persistence. Yet this calm is not passive. It is deliberate. Beneath the stillness lies a current of fierce pride. You see it in the red dragon that flies on the flag, a creature of myth that has become a symbol of modern defiance. The dragon does not roar. It watches, waits, and remembers. It represents not domination, but endurance through memory. Every time the flag rises over a rugby stadium or a small village hall, it declares something subtle but powerful. We are still here, and being here after so much attempted erasure is victory enough. In the modern age, where so many nations struggle with identity in the face of globalization, Wales offers a quiet counterpoint, a demonstration that strength can exist without shouting, and that a people can remain ancient and modern at once. Its success is not measured in size or influence, but in survival with soul intact. And as the night deepens and the mist rolls down from Snowdonia, it becomes easy to see how this endurance was possible. The land itself seems to hold its people in an embrace. The hills cradle the villages, the sea guards the borders, and the sky presses close as if listening to the earth's stories. There is no separation between nature and nation here. They are one and the same. The Welsh identity is carved from the same stone as its mountains, and like them, it cannot be destroyed, only reshaped by time. So, when dawn begins to break and the first light spills across the green slopes, illuminating the ruins and the new homes alike, you understand that this story, the story of Wales, is not one of tragedy or triumph. It is one of continuity. It is the story of a people who have mastered the art of surviving without forgetting, of changing without losing themselves. And as that golden light spreads over the land, touching every corner of history, one truth becomes clear. Wales does not simply exist in time, it holds time, guards it, and sings it softly into eternity. And now, as the story of Wales comes full circle, the land feels like a living memory, ancient, breathing, enduring. The mists that roll over the valleys at dawn seem to rise from the past itself, carrying whispers of every voice that has ever called this place home. There is no final chapter here, only a continuation, a slow turning of the same eternal wheel. The mountains watch over the lowlands, as they always have, indifferent to empire and time, yet deeply connected to the rhythm of those who walk their slopes. To fall asleep to the history of Wales is to drift through millennia of persistence, to feel the pulse of creation, conquest, faith, and rebirth weaving through every dream. Imagine the land in its earliest form, before Rome, before kings, when the air was thick with ritual smoke and the druids gathered in sacred groves to commune with the unseen. Their chants, carried by the wind, shaped the spiritual architecture that still underlies the Welsh psyche belief that nature itself listens, that every stone has a story, that every silence means something. When Rome arrived, it tried to quantify the land with walls and roads, but Wales resisted even structure. Its geography defied neat control, and its people, fierce, lyrical, loyal, remained bound to the wild. Centuries of invaders came and went, Saxons, Normans, English kings with armies and ambition. Yet every conquest only deepened the mystery, because none could erase the invisible power that holds this country together. It is not political or economic, it is spiritual, a faith in endurance. Every village built around its chapel, every poem recited in the glow of a pub, every song passed down through families is a small act of rebellion against oblivion. The long night of oppression, when speaking Welsh was punished, could have silenced the nation forever, but it did not. Instead, it refined it. The Welsh learned to hide their pride in plain sight, to weave identity into the fabric of everyday life until it became indestructible. When the coal mines roared to life and the valleys filled with smoke, the people adapted, again turning hardship into harmony. The Industrial Revolution was not kind to them, but it gave birth to a new kind of unity. Men sang as they descended into darkness. Women held communities together through music, prayer, and unbreakable will. The chapels filled each Sunday with hymns that rolled across the hills like thunder made holy. That sound, melancholic yet defiant, was the nation's soul in audio form. And when the mines went silent and the machinery rusted away, it was those same voices that carried the people forward. They did not let silence mean defeat. They turned it into reflection. In the aftermath of industry's collapse, when unemployment and migration threatened to hollow out the valleys, a quiet transformation began. Artists, teachers, and dreamers picked up where the workers left off. They built not with steel or coal, but with language, art, and memory. The Eisteddfod became a pilgrimage of culture, the Welsh Parliament a symbol of renewal. Even the landscape began to heal. Fields grew over the scars of extraction, rivers ran clear, and birds returned to sing in abandoned places. It was as if the land itself was forgiving humanity for its exhaustion. And through it all, the same question persisted: what does it mean to be Welsh? Is it a language, a geography, a history, or something more ephemeral? Something you can only feel when you stand in the rain at dusk and hear a distant choir practicing for a festival. Some say Welshness is an emotion rather than an identity, a quiet defiance, a melancholy hope, a belief that beauty and loss are not opposites but companions. You see it in the art that refuses to romanticize pain, in the humor that hides tenderness, in the songs that sound like prayers. There is something uniquely human about this endurance, reminder to the rest of the world that progress without memory is emptiness. In an era when cultures vanish under the weight of globalization, Wales stands as a lighthouse, small nation with an enormous soul, proving that preservation is not stagnation but strength. It shows that a people can live in the modern world without surrendering their ancient rhythm. Today, when the red dragon flutters against a grey sky, it is not just a flag, it is a heartbeat, a message to every small voice that thinks it might fade. It says, "You matter, you endure, you belong." The hills, the sea, the language, they are all witnesses to that truth. And as the world outside grows louder, Wales remains content to whisper, to sing softly into eternity, to let its legacy be carried not by empire or power, but by the simple act of remembering. So, as you close your eyes and let the sound of the sea merge with the hum of history, imagine this land breathing beside you, its stories unfolding like waves, one after another, endless. You are not just listening to history. You are part of it now, woven into the same thread that has bound this place together for thousands of years. And as sleep takes you, remember this: the story of Wales is not over. It continues every time someone speaks its name with love, every time the wind sweeps across the valleys, every time the night sky reflects on the still waters of a forgotten mine. It continues in silence, in song, and in you.